This podcast may contain explicit language. Welcome to the Greatest Movie of All Time podcast, the show that uses a unique grading style to redefine what the greatest movies are. I'm Tom Duncan.
And I'm Dana Duncan.
We also welcome our returning celebrity guest. You know him from episodes like The Fugitive. He's an author and host of the Most Writers Are Fans podcast, Terry Bartley.
Hey guys, I'm glad to be back.
Thank you for coming back. I know this has been kind of a year in the making.
Yeah, I'm a big superhero fan though, so super pumped to get into it.
I know this is a kind of a controversial one. You're either a Burton fan or you're a Nolan fan, seemingly, so this might get polarizing here as we go along. But I think you're in the Burton camp. Is that safe to say?
I mean, honestly, we'll get into it. More nuanced than that for me.
Okay. I like nuance. I don't know if the audience does, but I like nuance. We also welcome our newest celebrity guest, managing editor and senior film critic at moviearcher.com, Adam Freed.
Oh my goodness, what an introduction. Film critics don't get a lot of applause, so I really do appreciate that.
You're very welcome. And that means, since you're a first-time guest, with all new guests to the show, we'd like to ask a few questions to allow the audience to get to know you. First up, tell us just a little about yourself, what you do, and why you love movies.
I'm just your typical orphan son of billionaire parents, philanthropist by day, dark vigilante by night. But no, your introduction was very kind. I'm the managing editor at moviearcher.com. I'm also the senior film critic there. I'm very proud of being a part of Movie Archer. It's something that has experienced tremendous growth over the last couple of years. Very excited. I work with some really talented writers. It's afforded me the opportunity to travel the country, meet some really influential people. So I'm just really excited about that. Outside of work, so blessed to be married to an amazing lady who has given so much of her time to allow me to chase this dream. And as you guys know, with the amount of time and effort that you put into running the pod and your movie fandom, this doesn't come without a cost. And my wife is just absolutely brilliant at picking up all the loose ends and allowing me to live this life. And I really do appreciate it. I also have two amazing kids. Very excited. They're 7 and 10. They're up and coming movie lovers. My older one is going to be a critic when he grows up, I think. I'm trying to teach my 7-year-old to love movies. And when it comes to this idea of loving movies, the second half of your question, I love movies because they don't care what kind of day you're having. But that being said, there's a perfect movie for every kind of day. I don't know a lot about the technology of travel, but I do know that film is the greatest mode of transportation that I've ever experienced. Movies in my life have been the greatest time machine. In a theater seat, I can go anywhere at any time. Roman Empire, the Old West, a galaxy far, far away. And great movies have the ability to transport, unlike any other form of art that I've ever experienced. In addition to that, I love movies because they're something that we share. There's something that, like an heirloom, we can pass down through the generations. My parents loved Jaws. They showed it to me probably too early in life, but I love that movie. And I can't wait until my kids are old enough for me to pass that to them. And the last reason that I love movies so much is because they're permanent. And I'm not talking about the age of film that were great incendiary devices, but I'm talking now in the digital age. As soon as a movie comes out, it's now a permanent record. It's a piece of art that's going to outlive anybody on the planet right now. Whether it's Madam Web or Poor Things, our opinions of these films are one thing, but looking back 100, 200 years from now, these are still going to be here and we won't. And I think that that's a really cool thing about this art form that can't be said about a lot of other types of art.
Well said. So then, what is your favorite movie and why?
This is an impossible question. I respect that you ask it. You're asking me today, so I'm going to give you today's answer. I love the movie Casablanca. And Casablanca is my choice because it came along at such an important moment in American history. When production began, it was the great will they, won't they? Will the Americans get involved in what was going on in Europe, what was going on overseas? And as Hollywood was kind of nudging our government along in that decision, within the film by Michael Curtiz, you get this great will they, won't they between Bogart and Bergman. You have this unbelievable cast of characters. It was kind of like the Avengers of the time. And in addition to that, it was the greatest studio production of all time. This team of writers, they didn't even know how Casablanca was going to end the day that they started shooting. And somehow they put it together and they pulled it off. So with the historical context in mind, with my love for classic film, classic cinematography, today my answer is going to be Casablanca. Tomorrow, maybe something else.
You have just imbued yourself to my co-host immensely. It is our number 5 current film on our great master list.
There we go.
We've discussed it 3 different times so far. So it is definitely one that has come up a few times.
Dana, I knew that you were the smart one.
See, every guest says that after they've actually been on the show. I don't know what I did to deserve all of this other than just being a myopic host, but oh well.
It's the gray hair.
Oh,
wisdom.
yeah.
I wish I had any hair, so I'll take it.
Oh, fair enough. Last question. What makes a good movie for you?
Yeah, for me, good movies to great movies, they have to be the perfect intersection between art and entertainment. It's got to be that magical mix of Dorothy walking through the doorway into Oz, or it could be Neo and Bullet Time. A perfect film or a good film, it has to have the ability to make you think. It has to have the ability, but not the responsibility, to make you cry. And most importantly, I think good movies, they don't have to be perfect films, but good films, they have to incite wonder. And I don't think that there's enough in society today, especially when it comes to kids, that cause them to use their imagination. We're spoon-fed so much information. And I think film, as art, still has the ability on that car ride home, the bus ride home, or the walk home from the theater to get kids to think, well, what would happen if? And to engage that imagination in their mind that I think is kind of gone missing. And that's what I love about great movies.
So, without further ado, we will jump into tonight's movie. Tonight, for our 216th episode, we discuss the seminal comic book film Batman from 1989, celebrating its 35th anniversary this week. Directed by Tim Burton, written by Sam Hamm and Walter Scarron, music by Danny Elfman. Starring Jack Nicholson as Jack Napier or the Joker, Hugo E. Blick as the young Jack Napier, Michael Keaton as Bruce Wayne / Batman, Charles Roskilly as young Bruce Wayne, Kim Basinger as Vicky Vale, Robert Wool as Alexander Knox, Pat Hingle as Commissioner Gordon, Billy D. Williams as Harvey Dent, Michael Gough as Alfred Pennyworth, Jack Palance as Carl Grissom, Jerry Hall as Alicia Hunt, Lee Wallace as Mayor Borg, and William Hootkins as Lieutenant Max Eckhart. Recognition for this movie? Batman was originally wide released on June 23, 1989. Batman grossed $40.49 million during its opening weekend. This broke the opening weekend records held by Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade and Ghostbusters 2 of the same year. Additionally, it had the largest opening weekend for a Jack Nicholson film for 14 years until it was dethroned by Anger Management in 2003. Which I do actually enjoy that movie.
Yeah.
Batman also set a record for second weekend gross with $30 million, also the second biggest 3-day weekend of all time, and became the fastest film to earn $100 million, reaching it in 11 days. It would ultimately gross $411.6 million on a budget of $48 million. The film would hold the record for being the highest-grossing Warner Brothers film until 1996 when Twister surpassed it. It was the highest-grossing film based on a DC comic book until 2008's The Dark Knight. Furthermore, Batman held the record for being the highest-grossing superhero film of all time until it was taken by Spider-Man in 2002. The film's gross is the 143rd highest ever in the North American ranks, and although Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade made the most money worldwide that year, Batman was able to beat The Last Crusade in North America and made a further $150 million in home video sales. Batman was criticized for some by being too dark, but nonetheless received a generally positive review from critics, especially for the art and production design, score, and the performances of the two primary leads, Michael Keaton and Jack Nicholson. Comic book fans reacted negatively over the Joker murdering Thomas and Martha Wayne. In the comic book, Joe Chill is responsible, although that was something that was retconned later. That originally we didn't know who killed his parents. Joe Chill was a later addition. But it does change the lineage, per se. Sorry, Batman fan taking over here. Anyway, the songs written by Prince were criticized for being too out of place. While Burton has stated he had no problem with the Prince songs, he was less enthusiastic with their use in the film. On the film, Burton remarked, "I liked parts of it, but the whole movie is mainly boring to me. It's okay, but it was more of a cultural phenomenon than a great movie." Anton Furst and Peter Young won the Academy Award for Best Art Direction, while Nicholson was nominated for Golden Globe Award for Best Actor, Musical or Comedy, and the BAFTAs nominated Batman in 6 categories: production design, visual effects, costume design, makeup, sound, and actor in a supporting role for Nicholson. But it won none of these categories. The success of Batman prompted Warner Brothers Animation to create the acclaimed Batman the Animated Series, as a result, beginning the long-running DC animated universe and helping to establish the modern-day superhero film genre. Batman would spawn 3 other sequels in the 1990s, and it has been remade 3 times after that. Batman has been recognized by the American Film Institute on the following lists: AFI's 100 Years, 100 Movies, it was nominated for. AFI's 100 Years, 100 Thrills, it was also nominated for. AFI's 100 Years, 100 Heroes and Villains, the Joker was the number 45 villain, and Batman the number 46 hero. For AFI's 100 Years, 100 Movie Quotes, Have You Ever Danced with the Devil in the Pale Moonlight was a nominee. For AFI's 100 Years of Film Scores, it was also a nominated film score. For AFI's 10 Top 10, it was a nominated fantasy film. Batman currently holds a 77% among critics on Rotten Tomatoes, a 69 score on Metacritic, and a 3.6 out of 5 on Letterboxd. So, as we do each week, Dad, what is your relationship to this film?
Now you're putting me on the spot. With
You
all
know
these...
the question is coming. It's literally how I ended every week.
I know. This is the first time I've watched the entire film.
Wait a minute, what?
Yes.
That's not surprising to me.
You have to understand, first of all, this was released in June of 1989. I graduated from law school and started my first job in June of 1989. It's the first time my wife and I got married while I was in school. So she was living in La Crosse and I was living in Milwaukee. And so this is the first time we actually lived in the same house for a full week. So we didn't do a whole lot other than set up house and unpack and do stuff. And I didn't see it when it came out, and I just never bothered to see it. I've seen bits and pieces. Tom had all the toys when he was a kid, and I played Batman toys with him.
You'd be surprised how many times the Joker poisoned the water supply.
Yes. So, yeah, I always had to either be Joker or the Penguin. So, and that's fine. But yes, this is the first time I'd ever watched the film. Actually, I'm going in reverse. You're supposed to get old. As you're getting old, you get stodgy and more selective. And right, I'm going just the opposite. Things that I didn't really care that deeply about before, I'm actually learning to enjoy more now. I have broader interest and taste in music and films than I ever did when I was young. And so I just never bothered. And so I'm trying to rectify this gaping hole in my cultural fabric.
So, does this mean you're going to knock out the rest of Tim Burton's filmography?
I will watch the other 3 Batman films that he either directed or produced, but I probably will. But for the most part, I'm sorry. I've seen little bits and snippets of the maniacal Willy Wonka, and I'm not sure I want to sit through the entire thing.
Fair enough. I'd be shocked if you saw Alice in Wonderland, but that's a different movie for a different day.
I also saw about 15 minutes on HBO of Dark Shadows and was like, nah. I used to watch the soap opera Dark Shadows when it was on TV when I was a kid with my babysitter in the summers.
That's high quality childcare.
The same babysitter sat me down one Saturday night while my parents were at card club, and I watched Rosemary's Baby when I was about 6.
I always knew a movie was going to be good when I was a kid. When my dad looked at me and he said, "Hey, just don't tell mom." And as long as I got that, I knew I was in for something positive. Lethal Weapon at the age of 9. Let's go.
Well, unfortunately, the one time that really happened for me, I kind of ruined that. Anyway, I'll let you try and figure out what the film is. If anybody has any guesses out in the ether as to what film I betrayed my father on and its family lore, please make some guesses. I'll even give you a hint. I'm pretty sure it was 1999, if that helps at all. So, anyway.
Yes, and he not only betrayed me to his mother, he decided to do it while she was at a mother's group. So there were 4 other mothers sitting there.
Yep. Couldn't make it easy on you.
Yeah.
So clearly it was Eyes Wide Shut, right?
Not quite.
Terry, what's your relationship to the film?
Yeah, so I think I may use this as an opportunity to talk a little bit about the Nolan Burton of it all, because I think that that's relevant to my relationship with this movie. So I was born in '86. So this came out whenever I was 3 years old. I didn't watch it when I was 3, but like I definitely watched it when I was young. But I think that the important thing to note is like what basically was happening is like Batman movies were coming out all through my childhood, right? Like that's kind of like I just lived in a world where Batman movies were like regularly coming out. And I think for me, like I have a close relationship with Batman the animated series, which was very heavily inspired by this movie, right? In a lot of ways. And so I think that what happens in my mind is I compare, like I sort of like merged like this movie with that. And my association with a lot of this movie in particular, I think is very related to the animated series, which like is objectively great. But I think I've always, in my head, not enjoyed this movie, like in hindsight, because I always compared the Mark Hamill Joker to the Jack Nicholson Joker, which are like not even a little bit similar, right?
No.
I'll say, watching it again, like I feel differently now. We'll get into it later, but I feel differently now. But I always had a stronger like connection to the Nolan movies because I was like basically an adult whenever those came out, right? My Batman opinions were sort of formed already, and those lined up closer to like the comics and the animated series and like a lot of other Batman lore in a way that made more sense to me. So I always enjoyed the Nolan movies more, but I really hadn't revisited the Tim Burton movies until, I remember watching Batman Returns a number of years ago, maybe like a decade or so ago, and enjoying it not because it was a Batman movie, but because it was such a good Tim Burton movie. Like it was like so Tim Burton in so many ways that like as a Tim Burton fan, I enjoyed it. And for the record, Big Fish is really good. Check that out. That one is less fantastical as the other ones. Like you probably would really enjoy it. But I remember liking that, but I hadn't watched this movie in quite some time. So it was really cool to kind of revisit it. And I will say I like it a lot more now than I remembered liking it. So I always enjoyed this movie, but it was something that in my head I was like, oh, but I didn't love the Jack Nicholson performance. I didn't love, the way they portrayed this or that. And in hindsight, it's like, I don't really understand why I even felt that way. I think it was just like my association with the animated series was so strong that I like criticized this movie in comparison to it.
And what's your relationship, Adam?
So I'm a little bit older than Terry, and I had just finished second grade going into third when this movie came out. But the lead up to Batman started around the holiday season. I don't know if they called it a teaser trailer back then, but they had released like a 30-second spot, and all it was the Batman logo. And as a second grader, when you see the Batman logo on the silver screen, it did something to my brain chemistry. It changed the way I thought about movies. My parents did a nice job of taking me to some movies in the theater when I was a kid. This changed. This was the only thing I cared about for the 6 months leading up to it. The McDonald's cups, the toys, the logo was everywhere. The t-shirts were everywhere. This movie came out in June, and we'll talk about, the film itself in a little bit. It's all I cared about that entire summer. I think I saw it 3 times that summer, probably once per summer month. And then we roll into my 3rd grade year, and I begged my mom to make me a Joker costume for the school Halloween parade. And this is before the big box stores had your generic $39.99 clown outfit. So she went to every fabric store and she picked out the perfect fabric for the pants. She went and found the makeup, the hairspray, the whole thing. And just as an indicator of how much this movie meant to 3rd graders, I was so proud. She bought me, when you used to be able to bring the little fake gun to school that you pull the trigger, it says bang. I had the flower that sprayed the water. I showed up for our Halloween parade in my elementary school, and I looked around, and 8 other kids in my class, 3 of whom were girls, were all dressed as the Joker. And I was heartbroken. I mean, it meant that much to every kid that age. So I know Dana kind of missed it. He was getting involved in the law, not so much becoming a vigilante. Terry was probably a little young. It hit the bullseye. It hit me in the heart. This was one of the most important film-going experiences of my young life.
And I can understand that. I have to say that similarly, I felt the same way about a Batman movie. It just happens to be The Dark Knight. Because I was born in 1990, so I missed this initially. And for the most part, I missed all of the Batman films when they were in theaters, the first 4. And so by the time we got to the hiatus, I had kind of gotten introduced to the old Adam West Batman, which at this point I can barely go back and watch. They're just so bad.
No Cesar Romero.
Campy. Yeah, the bat shark repellent it gets me every time.
Bring it back.
But yeah, I like Terry, kind of grew up somewhat on the animated series, and that became a big part for me. I had a lot of the toys. One thing I've never truly revealed on the show, but my dad can attest to it. I had all of the Super Friends, Justice League characters, and I used to draft them on football teams where the heroes would play the villains. So I'd do action figure fantasy football.
Now, hold on. I got to follow that up. Tom, what position did Batman play on that football team?
So if I remember right, Superman was always the quarterback because he had the strongest arm, and Flash was my running back. If I remember right, Batman was a tight end.
That's good coaching, Tom. I have faith in you.
And I think Green Lantern was my star wide receiver because the Lantern ring could just, create a glove out of nowhere and just catch the ball.
There we go.
I would bet Batman was a captain, even though he wasn't a quarterback. He probably was one of the team captains. So,
well, I think knowing kind of the mythology and the lore since, he is the smartest of all of the Justice League people. So it would stand to reason that he'd be kind of like a player coach. So tight end would probably fit. Yes.
He wouldn't be the guy to give the rah-rah speech in the locker room, but he was like the lead by example guy. You need one of those on a good team.
Well, that's Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman's the speech person, right?
See, we're figuring this all out.
It was a Mike Ditka character.
I hope that wasn't a shot at Chicago now, Dan. Fair to say Aquaman has to be the water boy, or does he have a more active job?
Given that Wisconsin sports has relatively owned Chicago sports for the last decade, I don't think we need to take any shots.
Here we go.
We definitely don't need to reference certain teams from down south of the border. But anyway.
Let's keep this about movies, and I'll preserve my sanity.
Yeah. Okay, moving on. But yeah, certainly, I think the first true Batman film that I watched in a theater was Batman Begins. That one came out just after my birthday when I was 15. So I made a point of trying to go to that. And then The Dark Knight was something that just completely blew my mind because it's crossing over the adult film watching part of myself as I'd started to really form what I was as a film fan with all this mythology leading up to it. So I think there's a quality difference, but the two movies are vastly different achievements. They're trying to achieve different things and speaking to different audiences. This movie is aimed somewhat at kids, even though the Joker is unhinged. He's not quite nearly as terrifying, I would think, as Heath Ledger's Joker, who is much more sadistic and serial killer vibes, where there's a lot more violence to him comparatively. But this Joker is comedic. He kind of has a lot of Cesar Romero in him, with certain gags and different things that you don't get from Ledger's Joker. That's much more grounded and realistic. And so I think that we often compare the two films almost somewhat together because they're two eras of Batman. And I think whichever one you really truly experienced and embraced first is going to always hold a special place. It's kind of like which James Bond you grew up with, or the first one you're introduced to is always the guy that is going to be the one that's most close to you. For some people, it's Roger Moore. For some people, it's Sean Connery. I got introduced to Connery first, and then Daniel Craig kind of became my James Bond when I was kind of an adolescent. So I think similarly, we're going to have a lot of kids that are introduced to the Robert Pattinson Batman, and that'll be their guy. Even though I have my own issues with that portrayal and kind of how thinly written the Bruce Wayne side of that character is, we don't need to necessarily go into that film right away. This is just something that's always stuck with me. And so Batman's been an important part of my life. I've self-identified as a amateur Batman historian. I've been studying Batman and Batman comics and the histories of things for 20 plus years. It's one of probably my favorite characters in all of literature, film, etc. And so just having the opportunity to explore it, even though these I have my issues with, still is important for me.
Tom, I think you brought up a really good point about the generational ownership of the Batman figure. I don't know if you guys are familiar. It's not a great movie. It's called Neighbors. It's Zac Efron.
I just watched it.
Oh, you did? Okay, so Rose Byrne is in there, and he's with Seth Rogen, and they're at the party in the backyard, and it's way too late. And they have that generational debate about whose Batman is the real Batman. And as silly as that movie is, even though I appreciated the humor, I thought it really touched on something important. And it's kind of what you just brought up, Tom. Batman is whoever you need him to be. And as a second grader, that was my Michael Keaton. And it sounds like whether that was an animated version or onto the Christian Bale of it all, I think that that's something that has made this character permanent. And not every character, superhero or otherwise, can say that. And I think that that's a special thing.
And I'll say, I think it's a weirder thing that I'm actually much more protective of Heath Ledger being the Joker than I am Christian Bale being my Batman. Like, as many portrayals as we've had recently, and your mileage may vary on Joaquin. I think he's a great actor. I think that was a terrible movie. Jared Leto is just... yeah.
Nope.
And Mark Hamill being the voice along with Kevin Conroy. That, to me, defined a lot more of my childhood than Nicholson and Keaton did. So, but I can understand being a second grader how important that is to you, because by the time we get to the animated series 3-4 years later, you've kind of maybe grown out of some of that initial phase of how popular that was, as opposed to us who sat at home and that was like every day you get home and you rush home for that half-hour clip on Warner Brothers or WB or whatever channel it was. It was a different level of importance. And I think as we've continued to add more and more culture and media on top of each thing with the Batman and how it's been rebooted every 5 to 10 years, it adds a new generational layer on each one of these. And I do think they're all distinct to themselves. Ben Affleck is different than Christian Bale, is different than Robert Pattinson, that's different than Adam West, that's different than Kevin Conroy or Michael Keaton. And I don't want to shrift George Clooney or Val Kilmer, but unfortunately Michael Schumacher did. Anyway.
And it just for my own defense, I will point out that I grew up with the Adam West Batman. I mean, I watched it on TV when it was broadcast as a kid. and I watched it in syndication after school. So
do we need to cut into you and see how many rings there are?
Well, I'm just saying that, Batman wasn't that poignant because he was a buffoonish character. To me, as growing up, it was never really that important. I didn't read comic books. And so Adam West and, Frank Gorshin is the Riddler, and I'm trying to remember, Burgess Meredith is the
Caesar
Penguin.
Romero, Lee
Caesar
Merriweather,
Romero's Joker.
One of the Catwomen.
Yeah, Julie Newmar.
The most important thing that show taught me was the word onomatopoeia. I learned that the pow, the zap, and the bang, I knew that there was a word to describe those words. So the reader and the writer in me appreciates that show.
Yeah. And I think to your point, Tom, like it is interesting, like even to talk about Adam West, like Batman, whether it's comics, whether it's movies, TV shows, whatever, he's been relevant since like the 40s, 50s in culture to some extent. Like that's wildly impressive, like that's a lot of staying power.
Yeah, I think we had the 85th anniversary last year. If my memory serves, I think it was September of 1938 was the first appearance of Batman. So it goes back to the Depression era. That's how long we've been dealing with him and Superman. But is this movie actually about anything?
I think it is for Tim Burton. So if you look at Burton's run, and I'm going to recommend a short film in here, so just bear with me. If you look at Burton's run of success from the early 80s to the early 90s, and what happened after that, I think we've kind of touched on, and I think it'll come and go. But the central figures in Burton films are all the same person, and they're him. They are these socially isolated loners. They're misunderstood by the world around them. Look at his feature debut, Pee-wee, right? Pee-wee's Big Adventure. He's an awkward man-child that lives in this world where he talks to furnitures and chases down his bike. Nobody really understands Pee-wee, at least the normal people in his world. And when you look at that, there was a lot of Tim Burton, who he was as a person in there. Jump ahead to Beetlejuice. Now, I'm not saying he was some otherworldly demon, but look at Winona Ryder's character, Lydia. She was the dark, isolated loner with the big, dark, misshapen hair, the pale skin. She was Tim Burton. You jump ahead past Batman, you've got Edward Scissorhands. Same thing. Here comes my recommendation. 1982, Tim Burton creates a 7-minute stop-motion animated film. It's called Vincent, right? You look at the Vincent character. It is Tim Burton. It's narrated by Vincent Price, which is one of those amazing offshoots of him having worked for Disney for a few years before being let go. And this Vincent short film, the short stop-motion animation, I think it should be required viewing for anyone who's going to get into Tim Burton's work because it explains everything in 7 or 8 minutes. And once you've seen that, the Edward Scissorhands, the Jack Skellington, even though he didn't direct it, Nightmare Before Christmas was his baby. And then look at Bruce Wayne. Who's he? He's Tim Burton in that strange way. And so I do think that this movie meant an awful lot to the director.
No, so I will say I feel like your example of Beetlejuice is a great comparison because watching this time, I did not get that it was about Bruce Wayne. I didn't think this movie wasn't about Batman. Batman was a big part of the story. It wasn't about Batman. I thought this movie was about the Joker. Like this movie felt very much like the Joker was the main character in a lot of ways. And I think Beetlejuice is an interesting comparison because Lydia's the protagonist, but Beetlejuice is like the over-the-top, like, person you put on the poster, right? Like Beetlejuice is kind of like the draw of that movie still, even though he's not the protagonist. And I think that maybe like Tim Burton was trying to figure out how to tell those stories whenever he was doing like about that loner character. I don't think he really achieved it until after this movie. Like, I think that these were kind of like training grounds for whenever he became the director he eventually became.
I have 2 terms that I said what this movie is about: internal pain and retribution. It's I'm hurt by my world, and I'm looking for an opportunity to pay back all those people who are hurting me.
Well, I think you get at something that I thought the film was about, and that's maybe it's an overarching thing about the Batman versus Joker battle throughout time. It's the duality of fate. one internalizes all of his pain and suffering into trying to fight crime and supposedly do good by his community, taking the example of his parents and making something of himself, even if it's only through a symbol. And the other goes in the opposite direction where nothing matters. It's all anarchy. And so if I have this attitude where nothing matters, then I can just do whatever I want. I have complete freedom to disobey all the rules of society and poke fun at everything, the institutions that are there. I think that's one of the things that makes the Joker so appealing to most citizens, is this person that operates outside of the system at all times and is able to poke fun, if not outright just note all of the hypocrisy of institutions by themselves. So the nature of organizational, even though Batman is not necessarily organized, he has a moral code versus the total disorganization, the chaos of a Joker.
You're talking about, in part, every kid who has experienced the point where they're not allowed to sit at the cool kids table. Okay, and some of them in different ways. Some of them become a famous director. Some of them became a crime fighter. Some of them become lawyers.
Some of them become podcast hosts.
It's their own way of vindication. It's one of the reasons why I really love going to my high school class reunions.
Well, and that I do get from this movie, frankly. Like, I do get that. Because, you know, like, Joker was kind of that in a lot of ways. Like, he was sort of like this overlooked mobster guy. Batman was sort of a loner because his parents died when he was young. It sort of isolated him. Vicky Vale, like, seemed like she was never really taken seriously as a photographer until she sort of like put herself out there with the war crime stuff, like with the wartime photography. Same thing for Knox, right? Like, Knox feels like kind of an awkward guy that's like trying to be cool, and like this Batman is like his one chance to like really make a mark. So like I do see Dana's point very much.
Well, and then as the criticism has often gone, Batman is the only superhero, quote unquote, without superpowers, and thus is he a superhero. But he seems to stand taller than all of his peers in popularity among a mass audience. Does anybody kind of understand why he's more relatable or more popular?
I think you hit the nail on the head. I think it's so much easier to see yourself in someone who, you know, wasn't born in outer space or can't communicate with dolphins and breathe water. He's just a man. And yeah, he has incredible wealth and he's physically gifted, but he's something that a kid could feasibly grow up to be, the same way kids might dream of, you know, becoming a professional athlete. And so in that sense, the character from Adam West all the way through Robert Pattinson has always been more relatable than any of the other CGI-laden DC or Marvel films that we've seen.
Well, and I will say, I think that there's something interesting, because as a comic book fan, I've never honestly loved Batman, like as a character. No offense, Tom, I know that he's personal to you, but I've sort of felt, but I think that there is something sort of empowering about this idea, because I think there's something sort of problematic about Batman, right? Because he's like this super traumatized character that just lives in the trauma. Like, he just carries it with him everywhere, instead of trying to like deal with it and like figure out what his life can be after his parents died. Like, he's just sort of like hanging on to it. And I think there is something kind of empowering, in maybe like a twisted, problematic way, about like just sort of like letting your trauma motivate you and empower you to be the best version of yourself, which is Batman in this case, right? And I think that is something that maybe to people who sort of like dark secrets or things that they're living with, or they're depressed or whatever mental health issues they may have, like there's something empowering about Batman, because it's like, look, he has all these trouble, but it doesn't hold him back. I mean, it does in so many ways, but like in the very obvious way, it does not hold him back. And I think that there's something that is sort of empowering about that society can kind of latch on to.
I mean, can we agree? Batman's a complete maniac.
100%.
Can you imagine if he allocated the same amount of wealth and time as a billionaire to the Gotham City police force as he did to becoming this like single-handed vigilante? I love the character, but don't you think they could have solved more crimes if he had invested that in their police force?
Like, they could have like job programs and like recovery programs and all these other things that would like help reduce crime. That's not, you know, punching
the rundown orphanage where he grew up. Yeah.
Okay, think about the time when this film was released and why it resonated. we just came out of the individualism of the Reagan era. We still have George Bush in the White House. And there's a sense of culture of we need to be more altruistic. We need to reach out and do more. But we're still in this mentality of individualism. So Batman speaks to that because Batman's not going to use government. Heaven forbid. No, Batman's going to do it by himself because he's a super guy. I mean, I grew up in this period. I became a young adult during this period, and I just kept shaking my head about this whole streak of individualism and thinking about, boy, I can't imagine me doing anything solely by myself and actually achieving it. Everybody needs somebody. But that was the mentality. And I think that's one of the reasons why this struck such a chord culturally when it did. I think if this is released 5 years later, it does not have nearly the cultural phenomenon that it had at that moment.
And Dana, what's interesting about that point is in kind of in support of your point, you take the one supporting character that Batman could always rely on was Robin. And what do? They remove him from the equation entirely in this film.
And he's not been prominent in any other movie that wasn't comedic, right? Because even things like Batman Forever, Batman and Robin, those have a lighter tone. And the other, like any serious Batman movie does not have a Robin. Or there's a dead Robin costume in Ben Affleck's Batman.
I take Chris O'Donnell very seriously.
You might be the only one outside of the can't find the remote crowd that watches NCIS, whatever it is.
We might have to edit that out then.
We're not on CBS.
That's true. That's true. So does this movie deserve more credit for the eventual rise of the comic book film genre than Superman, the original movie?
I have a very nuanced take on this. I think that this movie benefits a lot from nostalgia. I think that we look back at like Michael Keaton's performance and a lot of these other things in the movie, like a lot of the like iconography. I think that it benefits from the animated series happening so close after it. Because I think that there is a lot of like dual association with like Tim Burton's Batman and animated series Batman. And I honestly feel like the superhero genre as we know it now wasn't really established as the phenomenon and like this like endless franchise thing until we got to like X-Men, Spider-Man. But I do think that those things wouldn't have happened if we hadn't had the animated series, if we hadn't had, X-Men the animated series and Spider-Man the animated series, which I think all wouldn't have existed without this movie. So I think that this movie does deserve some credit, but it's because it like was the first domino that like sort of like started this like superhero revolution that happened in culture.
Don't get me wrong. I think when we discussed Superman the movie, it was a big deal. And it was obviously like one of the top grossing movies. Superman 2 was a top grossing movie. But when you prove concept by doing it with a completely different character, a different tone, and make something else that people want to see, I think it at least spurns that this had potential. Even if we didn't have the crowning achievement of an X-Men or a Spider-Man, and then eventually the Nolan Batmans to really solidify the comic book era. And I would give credence to the fact that the Nolan Batmans, to me, really was the kickoff of the true comic book era. But even before that, you had to have these precursors lay down a foundation that the audience was there to have your back if you were going to make and invest a significant amount of your time and effort in these movies.
I also think, though, that Chris Nolan is the tremendous beneficiary. And I don't say this to take anything away from him because I think he's an amazing filmmaker. He had the benefit of knowing he was going to make that trilogy in IMAX, with IMAX cameras, to a large screen format, to large stadium seating theaters. Tim Burton didn't have that. In a lot of ways, and with all respect to what Richard Donner did with Superman, it created 3 sequels, right? But it didn't give Hollywood a jumping off point. It didn't give a blueprint of like, this is how it's done. And my question is, had Tim Burton not had the success that he had with this film, and then of course 3 years later with Batman Returns, at what point does that happen for superhero films? So I think even in an honest moment, Nolan would admit he learned an awful lot because this film was as much about the marketing campaign as it was about the execution of the story. There is no Jurassic Park 4 years later with that dinosaur skull logo without the success of Batman. There is no Marvel. There is no DC. So I do think that we've got to, for lack of a better term, put a little bit more respect on what it was that Tim Burton had to harness, the responsibility that he had to carry, and then what he actually achieved. I mean, you led this show talking about the box office numbers. It worked, and you can't debate that.
This ultimately, going back and remembering when this whole thing started and they were casting this, I swear that the decision to cast Michael Keaton was as much about the fact that it would cause controversy and buzz as anything, because he was a comedic actor up until this point in time, and no one thought he was going to be anywhere close to as effective as Batman. I mean, all he had to do was show up and not like drool on himself, and most people would have said, "Hey, he was pretty good." But he actually was really good because he had that sense or that ability to be a brooding character and to come across as dark and introspect. I swear that was part of the whole marketing campaign. Was originally they were talking about finding an actor who was an unknown, which would have caused buzz, but then to put a comedic actor in there in that role only caused just people to go nuts, especially the Batman fans.
I mean, there was a coup. There was a write-in marketing campaign against Warner Brothers. People were livid about Keaton being cast in this role. I've got a theory as to why that might have been, Dana, in support of what you just said. It might show up in our Did You Know section, but I think it has a lot to do with his co-star.
And see, this is his only first time podcasting, and he's already doing teasers.
Wow.
I grew up so fast.
And I will say, I do think that a movie like this, like a blockbuster that basically was about the marketing campaign, right? Like there was like a lot of toys, a lot of whatever. I think it was inevitable for a movie like this to come out because of the Saturday morning cartoon stuff was happening, where like basically every cartoon was a toy. Like I think that we were getting to this kind of movie happening. I agree that this movie was wildly successful. Like it was a good version of that. But I don't want to say that there wouldn't have been like a Marvel movie that might have been successful. Like an earlier version of a Spider-Man could have potentially accomplished something similar to this, right? So like I do think that it deserves credit, but I don't want to say that we wouldn't have gotten to where we are now without it, because the cultural zeitgeist was heading this direction.
All right, Dad, are you ready to give us some more background on the movie? Do you have a plot summary ready for us?
I do. In Tim Burton's Batman, we are plunged into a dark, brooding Gotham City where crime festers in the shadows and hope seems a distant dream. The film opens with a scene that establishes the city's grim atmosphere, a place where danger lurks around every corner. Bruce Wayne, Michael Keaton, the reclusive billionaire, conceals a dual identity as the masked vigilante Batman, striving to bring order to the chaos. Batman is a triumph of style over substance, a visual feast that captures the essence of the Dark Knight. It is a film where the atmosphere and aesthetic take precedence, creating an unforgettable experience that redefines the superhero genre. Batman may be a figure shrouded in darkness, but Burton's film sheds a new light on the mythology of the caped crusader.
Thank you. Did you know? Writer Sam Hamm said it was Burton's idea to have the Joker murder Wayne's parents. Quote, "The writer's strike was going on, and Tim had the writers do that. I also hold innocent to Alfred letting Vicky Vale into the Batcave. Fans were ticked off with that, and I agree. That would have been Alfred's last day of employment at Wayne Manor." And I will offer up the second one here to our guest, if he wants to take his opportunity.
Forgive me if I'm bad at it. Did you know Batman made $750 million in merchandise sales in 1989, 1990, and 1991?
Did you know Robin Williams was offered the role of Joker when Jack Nicholson hesitated? He had even accepted the role when producers approached Nicholson again and told him Williams would take the part if he did not. Nicholson took the role and Williams was released. Williams resented being used as bait, and not only refused to play Riddler in Batman Forever, but also refused to be involved in any Warner Brothers productions until the studio apologized. Did you have another one?
Did you know that
There you go.
Nicholson took the role at almost half of his going rate, which at the time was $11 million? He agreed to play the Joker for $6 million with a couple of rules. Number one, he would not work during Lakers playoff games. And if you remember your basketball history, the Lakers made it all the way to the NBA Finals that year, and they beat the Detroit Pistons in 7 games. So the NBA season went as long as it possibly could, and Nicholson did not work on a single day. In addition, his contract stipulated that he would get top billing on the poster. Nicholson would be the first name featured in the opening credits of the film, and for taking $5 million less than he usually does, he would get a percentage of the VHS, cable, and merchandise dollars, which totaled him $90 million in total to play the Joker.
So, you're stepping a little bit on my next one, but did you know Nicholson received a percentage of the gross on the film, and due to its massive box office take, he took around $60 million just for the film itself. When adjusting for inflation, this equals roughly $143 million in 2022.
Always take the percentage.
That's the takeaway from the whole show. Always take the percentage.
Yep.
Did you know that Michael Keaton was an avid wearer of Nike shoes, and the original Batsuit featured Nike Air Trainer 3s, which they blacked out and he wore throughout the entire film. 3 years later, Batman Returns, Keaton wore Air Jordan 6s in the second Batsuit, and he still has them to this day.
Did you know? Jack Nicholson loved his performance in this film so much that at one point, he was watching the film once a week at his own house. Nicholson said of his role, "The thing I like about the Joker is that his sense of humor is completely tasteless." He later said the Joker was one of his favorite roles he played.
You got me beat. I'm out.
Okay, I got one left. Did you know? Michelle Pfeiffer, who was dating Michael Keaton at that time, was asked to audition for Vicky Vale, but Keaton was against it, saying it would be awkward. Pfeiffer would later be cast alongside Keaton as Selina Kyle / Catwoman in Batman Returns, after their relationship had ended. And with that, we will take our first break, and we will be right back. Before we jump back into the episode, next week for our 217th episode, we welcome back returning guest Sarah Duncan to the show, and new guest Joe Bakari, a Instagram film commentator from I'll Get to It When I Get to It, to discuss one of the most controversial Best Picture winners of all time for its 30th anniversary, Forrest Gump from 1994. Directed by Robert Zemeckis, written by Eric Roth, music by Alan Silvestri, starring Tom Hanks, Robin Wright, Gary Sinise, and Sally Field. You won't want to miss that one, so watch ahead of the show by searching the Real Good app to find where it's streaming for you. That's REELGOOD. So before we move back into the regular portion of the show as well, Terry, what has been going on with you?
Yeah, so I'm still busy as an author. I've got a couple books out now. I think whenever I was with you guys last time, I hadn't released anything yet, where I maybe had like just released something. So I now have a book called Tyranny of the Fae, which is a collection of short stories. It's a lot of like world building. There's 3 main characters. They each have like arcs that are separate, and they kind of go through like 100 years or so of the timeline of the universe and like how it came to be. So I think it's a cool sort of like glance into the world. I've got a couple of light novels if you don't want something quite so long. There's one called I'm a Princess that ran away to a magical world, about an elven princess that sort of like goes to this other world and becomes an adventurer and sort of like hides her identity. Another one called Me and My Best Friend Became Adventurers in a Fantasy World, about an orc and a goblin who are best friends that sort of like go off and become adventurers. And what is that for they travel the whole planet. We see the whole world through their eyes. So those are both out. I've also been playing D&D with Enchanting Sorcery Productions. We do a Twitch stream every other week. So they're playing tonight, actually. So I will probably be joining them later on tonight. But I'm playing, we're doing a campaign called Halia's Harriers. We're all like Zentarum agents, which is like sort of like the Dark Seedy organization. We're trying to like overthrow this fascist government. So it's a fun time. So definitely check that out if you're a fan of TTRPGs.
All right, great. And how's the podcast going?
Oh, right. I also host a podcast. Thanks for I host a podcast called Most Writers Are Fans, where I interview other writers. And I'm very broad about that term. I interview like authors and journalists and songwriters and game designers, like all kinds of different kind of like writing creative people. It's mainly about like independent creatives and like how they manage like this world that we all kind of like live in and the challenges and stuff. So it's been a cool experience to kind of like build this like network of other indie creatives and get to kind of like share experiences, but also like sort of commiserate a little bit on all the hard times with other people, which is a nice thing to do. I have an episode coming out next week. I'm going to start going to every other week, so there'll be episodes coming up pretty soon. The next one is going to be with a musician named Spencer Jordan. He's a singer-songwriter. We got into kind of like trying to make it as a musician, but also he's a full-time songwriter outside of being an independent musician. So like, what is it like finding a job that's like a steady job in the industry? And then how do you balance that with like your own creative endeavors? So yeah, it's a good time.
It is.
Excellent.
I enjoyed several episodes this afternoon while I was doing paperwork.
Thanks so much. That's very sweet. I appreciate it.
Very cool. Adam, what's going on over at Movie Archer?
It's been a very busy summer so far. I got a chance to fly out to Los Angeles, meet with a really interesting young director by the name of Marcellus Cox. Made an awesome independent film called Mickey Hardaway on a budget of about $30,000. It's available on Tubi right now, Apple Plus. It's available on the Amazon platform. And just had a great sit-down lunch with him, getting some insights about how much of his actual life popped up in that film. So I just thought that was an awesome opportunity, and what an intelligent and talented young filmmaker he is. And then just last week, I was on the other side of the country in New York for the Tribeca Film Festival. Spent 6 days, 6 very long, busy days at Tribeca. Got a chance to watch and cover 15 films in that amount of time. Got a chance to work a couple red carpets, bumped into a couple familiar faces that I had kind of grown up idolizing and looking up to. And so it's just been an amazing run so far this summer, and hopefully the best is yet to come, especially with this appearance on this podcast.
Well, thank you for that honor, but I don't know if we have quite the same reach that some of your other familiar faces do, but we try. So before we jump into the rest of the show, one other thing. This is normally our Ask Dana Anything segment. And while we don't have a specific question, I do have a follow-up from our superfan from last week. So if you were listening to the Chinatown episode and happen to hear about a film that we may cover in the very near future called The Castle, which is apparently an Australian film, she is willing to sweeten the deal and send us a box of Australian snacks. We can take or leave the Vegemite.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I've
You know
never
what
had
Vegemite
it.
is?
I do not.
It's
but
beer
I've heard
yeast. It's the leftover beer yeast after you've brewed beer, and they smear it on bread.
Well, that seems rather redundant, but I'd be willing to at least, maybe try it.
It's like
just
sucking
for
the
novelty.
bottom of a bag of pretzels.
Well,
Give it a go, Dana. Come on.
Ugh. Okay.
Now, she did include something called Tim Tam Slam, which is apparently something to add to your coffee or have with it, if that makes any difference at all. I don't think that's personally going to sweeten the deal enough for me to move it up in our timeline, but I am pretty positive that we will discuss that film at a later date in the near future.
Isn't that kind of an oxymoron?
Yes, I'm trying not to be specific so as to tie myself to anything.
Which is probably the number 3 response or portion of the response to why Tom is still single.
Shots fired.
Oh, well, yes, the episode that came out today. Yeah,
I listened to it.
Yeah, well, thank you, but yeah. Anyway, moving on. Best performance is up. Dad, who do you have down?
I have Jack. You just can't not pick him in this particular film. He's as big as the film itself.
Yeah, maybe bigger. I also went with Nicholson here. What I love so much about seeing this, and it kind of bookends the decade, him starting the 80s with Jack Torrance and The Shining, just how much of the DNA they share, especially after his transition into becoming the Joker. There's a lot there. The second half of Shining, second half of Batman. It's almost like his performance at times has a way of swallowing the rest of the film and Keaton himself. So I agree with Dana. I'm going to go Nicholson.
I also put Jack Nicholson. But I also had two options. Because I think that Jack Nicholson is like the clear like acting winner. I also secondarily put Danny Elfman as the composer because I think
Very
that
good.
it's hard to understate how iconic the score of this film is and how it's been like sort of forever associated with Batman after this. Like it's hard to think of Batman and not think of this Danny Elfman score. So I did also put Danny Elfman for best performance.
So I'm going to be the outlier then, and I will gladly take that up. I don't have Jack nominated for any of these categories.
Hello.
Okay.
So there's a part of me that has, as I'm watching the film, a difficulty with how clownish the performance is and how drastically over the top it is. And yet,
you know that Joker's a clown, right? You do know that Joker is a clown character. He's called the Clown.
I was
Prince
just thinking it, Terry.
point taken. I knew it when I said it, and I'm glad you hit that volley. But anyway, there's a part of me that just thinks it's too cartoonish. And when I first sat down and I put all of my responses down, I'm just like, okay, I'm out on Keaton. I'm out on Jack. Let's nominate other things around it that I really much more appreciated about the film. And then as I've sat with this for the last couple of days, I've kind of started to warm on Jack and his performance in this. And I'm like, was it really that bad? No, probably not. But even so, I'll be the outlier and give some extra attention elsewhere since you all three went with Jack. I'm going to go Anton first and Peter Young, the production designers. I think the look of the film really creates a character unto itself. Gotham becomes kind of a mythical city by the how it's translated on film in this movie. And so from the Gothic perspective, the kind of dark and gloominess, but also feels like a lived-in city, there are certainly certain set pieces, the front facade of whether that's City Hall or whatever it is, to the churches that are available in the film. I think all of that really worked for me. And so I can definitely see how this won an Academy Award for those two specifically. But I think that the creation of that extra layer or that extra character really adds some decent depth that you don't otherwise have in the film. And so I went there. Now, on the musical cue, I will say, and I will preempt it a little bit before I get to my best secondary, but my most charismatic is the Batman theme itself. Now, whether or not you want to credit this movie specifically or the fact that I grew up with the animated series and Danny Elfman reworked that theme song to be part of the animated series. So every time that would come on, it would be that opening montage set to that score. But that plays in your head more than anything that the Nolan universe ever created. Even though I love the music from the Nolan Batmans, just not quite the same as tying it to the character so specifically. And you hear the rhythm section of it. It gets you every time. My best secondary, though, I actually thought it was Kim Basinger. I thought she was actually really good in this. I know it's going to draw some ire. Fine. But I actually thought for being the girlfriend, she wasn't just somebody that's there to kind of deliver the plot, that she had some character to herself, that she was a little bit spunky, that she was trying to get him out of his dark loneliness a bit. And so I thought she had a lot to actually offer and was written as a better character than sometimes even appears in the comics. So for me, I went Basinger.
So I'll play off of that a little bit because I really wanted to put Kim Basinger for best secondary performance. I couldn't because I feel like the script is so strange for a lot of the characters. And Kim Basinger, like Vicky Vale, I think is probably the protagonist of this movie. Like if you want to look at like POV, I think they were following it mostly through Vicky Vale's eyes, honestly. But I feel like they didn't give her a lot to do. I think that we're told who Vicky Vale is a lot and not shown who Vicky Vale is very much at all. So that's not to discount her performance. I think that she did a great job with what she was given. But I think that like she just didn't really like bring the character to life in any kind of way that like stood out to me. And honestly, same for Michael Keaton for me. I felt like Batman wasn't like, or Bruce, either one was written in such a way that like really like stood out to me. So my secondary performance is actually Robert Wall as Knox, because I think that he did a lot with the little he was given. So I put him for secondary because he at least felt like a character to me. And I think that it had a lot more to do with his performance than the writing of the character.
I got to ask a Knox question. Is he the worst reporter in history? And I think Wall's performance was great. The photographer, Vicky Vale, does more investigative reporting in this film and unearths more information about Bruce Wayne, about Jack Napier, about everything that's going on with Grissom. And all we're really getting from Knox is like a witty retort or a shot at a politician. He doesn't accomplish anything as a reporter.
But Vicky Vale's reporting is almost like happenstance. Like she investigates Bruce Wayne because she's curious about this guy she likes. Like she doesn't investigate Bruce Wayne because she thinks it has anything to do with Batman.
She's like TMZ.
Yeah. So like Vicky Vale, and I don't think that she demonstrates good journalism. It's just that she's a curious person that finds answers, and I guess that's journalism, kind of, but not to any ends that she intended. I think that Knox is like, this story is so unique and strange that if I can break it, then like I finally can be like they keep talking about Pulitzers in this movie, right? So he's like, finally, this will be my chance to be like a acclaimed journalist. So I think he's just so desperate to like get that win. That's why it feels like he's not doing anything, because he just goes to every interview and says, "So what about Batman? Have you heard, what do you think about this Batman thing? What do you think about Batman?" And it doesn't feel like good journalism because he's just asking anyone willing to answer the question, or even not willing, just anyone that will listen to him.
Now, the thing that I would point out, and I thought about Kim Basinger, but the problem with that is the character itself. It's a stereotype, which is, hey, it's the good-looking girl that's going to change the brooding, recluse guy and make him into something that he's not.
Okay.
I guess I'm gonna be the one on secondary that goes Keaton here, and I'm doing that with respect to what Dana brought up earlier, which was the backlash against his casting initially. This is a movie called Batman, and even though he didn't get top billing at playing Batman in the Batman movie, if he's bad, this thing is a dumpster fire. And if he doesn't pull it off, there is no sequel, there is no trilogy that ended up turning into all of everything that this movie turned into. And Keaton pulled it off. Now, his performance, I think, Terry, you might have said before, there was nothing that really stood out about it. He's a maniac. I mean, we're going to get into some quotes later, but you want to get nuts? Let's get nuts. I mean, there are so many cues in this film that I picked up when I rewatched it this week that he is every bit as nuts as the Joker. And for Keaton to play it that far on edge, and in my opinion, with that great deal of success, I think it's worth the secondary performance nod here.
Like, I don't think he was bad in the role. I kind of just generally agree with Terry that for me, what is the meatiness of his character? We really get nothing other than he's sad over his parents. There's very little character development of any of the characters in this film.
I have Tim Burton.
Oh, do tell.
Shocking. Shocking.
Actually, I thought this is one of the best Tim Burton films I've seen because it's pacing, it's quick, it's well timed. There's nothing that's really a slow period in it. The camera angles, he goes from having still shots to having handhelds, and you can tell the difference because he's using handhelds at points in time where you're supposed to be picking up the anxiety that's associated with the shakiness of the camera. I just thought he did a very good job overall in putting the film together and creating a total atmosphere as a package.
Couldn't agree more.
Most charismatic. I already gave mine, so who would like to go?
I'll just get mine out of the way since I was the last one to speak. I have Michael Keaton, and it's for one reason, which is Michael Keaton proved that he was a better actor than the roles he had been playing. He had kind of a hiatus after Batman where he didn't do a whole lot. I don't know what he did. He kind of out of films for a while, I thought. But he's made a remarkable comeback with a string of films over the last 10, 15 years, and then his Dope Sick Emmy win and such. I think he established himself as being a much bigger actor than the comedic actor that was in Night Shift and Mr. Mom.
I like it. I think if we're talking about charisma, how can we avoid Jack Nicholson here? But because we've talked about Jack so much, I'm going to go with a different Jack. I'm going to go Jack Palance. Now, he has a very small role, and Carl Grissom dies pretty much at the end of this film's first act. But it is so much fun to see Palance on screen again. And, you know, somebody my age, I didn't get a ton of him other than The Legend of Curly's Gold, et cetera, et cetera. But Palance was so much fun because he was allowed to cook. And I got the idea that he probably had, 15 lines of dialogue in the whole film. And he said, if I'm going to be here and shoot this thing in 3 days, I'm going all in. I'm pushing all my chips to the middle. And he did that. And I really, on a rewatch, I had a lot of fun watching Palance play Carl Grissom.
I've also got a pretty off-the-wall pick for most charismatic. I picked Billy D. Williams as Harvey Dent. Because, first of all, Billy D. Williams just exudes charisma, right? Anything he does. And I have a feeling he probably took this job with the presumption that he would eventually be Two-Face. So that's unfortunate that we never got to see his Two-Face, which would have been great. Maybe not if Joel Schumacher directed it, but that's neither here nor there. But I did enjoy his performance, and I think what I liked about it was the potential of what we could have had but never had. And that's why I sort of liked his Harvey Dent so much, because it made me think about how great would he have been as Two-Face.
Can I step on one of our remaining questions? I know we're going to get there at the end of the show. Does anybody know what happened? Why wasn't Billy D brought back? I thought he was a great Harvey Dent.
So they just had the opportunity by the time they got to Batman and Forever to do Tommy Lee Jones right after he'd won the Oscar. So they just went with somebody that they thought would be a little bit better known name. That's really all it was. They released him from his contract.
Probably not as popular a decision in the modern Hollywood, but it was what it was at the time.
It happens all the time. You get recastings and all of these things, and they were going from Keaton to Kilmer anyway, so what's the difference?
It really would have changed his legacy, though, right? If he'd have been Two-Face. If he could have had Two-Face and Lando on his resume, he would have been this sci-fi icon. But now he's really just Lando.
But he's Lando and he's Gale Sayers. You can't take that away.
See, you're the one talking about the Bears, Tom, not me.
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't really need to. The ownership papers are already transferred to one Jordan Love. But anyway, moving on. Let's go to best scene then. I have 5 different nominees here that I think cover, for the most part, most of the big set pieces in the film, which, this is kind of a set piece film to begin with. But any of those that you want to add, we'll cover after I'm done here. So first, I'm Batman, just the opening. Kind of the montage, and that kind of becomes the basis for the theme song montage of the animated series. It's kind of like a recreation of that, essentially. Then I have Axis Chemical, which I don't know why they changed it from Ace Chemical. In the comics, it's always been Ace Chemical. Why we needed a change makes no sense to me, but okay, fine. But essentially the sequence where Jack ends up in the bathtub of goo or whatever the hell the toxic runoff is that's in there, and why you would just keep a vat of that on site is beyond me, but okay, sure. Then you have Flugelheim Museum, also an odd name or an odd name choice, but obviously I think that's one of the more iconic things in the film. I have the parade.
Play on the Guggenheim.
Well, obviously, Dad.
Well, okay, obviously, but you didn't make that obvious, so all right, whatever, that's fine.
Because it was so obvious it didn't need to be mentioned.
You guys save it for Thanksgiving.
Yeah, well, or next week. Anyway.
Okay.
I have the parade, obviously with the parade balloons and the release of things, and then the Joker dancing to a Prince song, which, cool, I guess. And then I have the final showdown in the church. So any other scenes that anyone would like to add to our list?
I got a couple. I put the crime boardroom scene, like the scene after Jack becomes the Joker and he's trying to like negotiate with the guys whenever he kills the guy with the buzzer. I think that's a really cool like villain intro for Joker. So that was one of them. The other one was Vicky Vale's apartment, the "you want to get nuts, let's get nuts" scene that Adam referenced earlier. I think that's, first of all, it's the most Michael Keaton gets to do. It's the biggest performance he gets to do the whole movie. So let's point to that. But also I think it's a cool like Vicky Vale Joker like dynamic scene there. So I also threw that one in there.
I don't know if you guys noticed this, but kind of tagging on to what Terry just said about the Vicky Vale apartment scene. Keaton arrives first as Bruce Wayne, looks around, he says, "There's a lot of room." When the Joker shows up, what's the very same thing he says? "There's a lot of room." And I think that Burton was using that scene to kind of show how similar these two characters really were. And I do think that there was intent behind that. That wasn't a mistake that they uttered the exact same lines of dialogue. So, Terry, I like that choice. I thought that was a very interesting scene if you really read between the lines.
Or they, like me, just noticed that somehow a photojournalist is living in that massive apartment in what's supposed to be New York City.
It's like the Friends apartment.
Just could never happen.
She's independently wealthy. She doesn't make her money from photojournalism.
Oh, okay. But yeah, we got that in her character backstory somehow. The massive amounts of character development. Yeah.
And she's got a rich kind of boyfriend.
Okay, but he's not paying for her rent. At least that we know.
Maybe that's not what he's paying for.
Oh, no.
Oh, Dad. Anyway, all right. So then, best scene. Here are your nominees to pick from: I'm Batman, Axis Chemical, Gangster Meeting, Flugenheim Museum, Let's Get Nuts, Parade, and Final Showdown. Out of these, what is the best scene?
I'm going to go with I'm Batman. And the reason is, I mentioned before, we had 6 months of lead up to this movie. We had the logos and the cups and the t-shirts and the whole thing, and we've discussed it. If our introduction to that character and to that actor playing that character doesn't work or falls short, or he looks like Woody Allen in a bat suit, we lose the audience, we lose the franchise, the whole thing is toast. But when he picks up that drugged out villain and he holds him over and he lowers the register, and I'm not going to do the impression because I'm not an actor, but when he does that, it worked. It worked when I was 8. It worked when I was 43, and I watched it this week. So the second we saw him, we said, I'm in. This thing is going to work now.
You know, I'm going to have a dream of Woody Allen in the Batman suit now.
You do you.
Anyway, I would agree. I think it is central to the Batman mythos, and you do have to have that kind of establishing point in the film, and to have it so early on where you don't have this like lineage or this incline into who the Batman becomes. You don't have this origin story. You just have a jumping off point, quite literally. I think that's a really good establishment of the character and the importance of what the film is supposed to be. It's the first real iteration of what we get from this character on screen, and to have that be such a forceful entrance, I think is important to the establishment of the entire film, even if I do somewhat agree with Terry that it is kind of more of a Joker film.
So I agree with everything you've said. Probably my vote would go to that one, just for the sake of making this a little bit more variety. I'm going to speak a little bit about the final showdown scene. I think it's maybe the best scene as far as like to try to make the movie make sense from a writing perspective, because they bring a lot of threads together that felt very like, what was this when you saw it like earlier? So like a lot of those, like, you know, you made me, the Batman says, no, you made me, like those were good lines. Sort of like bringing a lot of stuff together that I think made the script maybe make a little more sense than it did up to that point. I think that's good. And also, like, there's a lot of cool stuff in the fight, like the stuff with the Joker, on the with the gargoyle at his foot, like that stuff's good. Him like dancing, trying to knock Vicky and Batman off the top. Like, there's a lot of cool like fight scene moments too. I'll voice a little bit of a support for the final showdown scene.
I have I'm Batman is my best scene for the very same reasons that most of you have indicated. Again, it just kind of sucks you in and provides you with the hook that gets you into the rest of the film.
And with that, it's also my favorite scene. It's just a nice, again, establishing of the character and the brand right from the start. And it has so much iconography tied into it. How many people have been repeating, I'm Batman, forever because of that one moment in the film and how striking it is the first time you see it.
100%. I love the scene. I chose it as my best scene, but my favorite scene from a filmmaking perspective, and you're going to have to bear with me on this because it does involve a little cross-cutting. We're going to sew this thing together. The Jack Napier transformation into the Joker, you go into this, it looks like a rundown veterinarian's clinic or something, and he had just fallen into the acid. You get this single bulb, right? And so you get this iconic dark silhouette of Napier. Before we ever see him as the Joker, he gives that iconic laugh for the first time. He shatters the mirror. We cross-cut to Vicky and Bruce. They're on their date. They're trying to make their way up the stairs. They've had too much to drink. The next thing we do, we cross-cut back to following Napier, and he's stepping out of the elevator in Grissom's lair. And to mirror the image that we talked about before with that single bulb, that backlit silhouette, he steps out of the elevator and there's a single light. And all you see is the darkened silhouette, but it's no longer Napier. Now it's the Joker. And as he steps forward toward the camera, we finally see just the slightest hint of the bright red smile of that iconic pasty white face. And he said, "It's me, Sugar Bumps," right? That moment was our introduction to the most important character in this movie. And if you allow for a little bit of cross-cutting, that scene, that transformation, I think is movie magic.
Yeah, my favorite scene was the museum scene. I think it's a lot of fun, and I think it's a cool like exploration of the Joker character. Like, we get a lot of so I talked about how, like, whenever I thought about this movie, like in memories, I didn't like it because I didn't like the portrayal of the Joker. I felt like it was like not comic book accurate, and that like offended me on some weird personal level. But on the rewatch, I think this scene and like a number of other like things about his plots in this movie in general made me come around a little bit, because I like that he did things that were like malicious purely for the sake of being malicious. Like, he did a lot of things in this movie that there was no like rhyme or reason to, and that's very Joker to me. And I liked that a lot. And I think that the museum is maybe like the epiphany of that, like them like ruining the art, like just for the sake of doing it, for like the fun of it. Like, and also not for nothing, I didn't mind the Prince music in this movie. I thought it was kind of cool to have Prince as like the personal soundtrack of the Joker. I don't know how Jack Napier got Prince to do those songs, because that was like a custom Joker song that they were playing in the museum. But it was like, you know, I enjoyed that scene a lot. And also, like, I think it also does a good job of establishing that, like, tension that builds between Vicky and the Joker. Like, you also get a bit of that in this scene also. So, yeah, I think that the museum scene, first of all, while it was just, like, a fun scene to watch, just from a purely, like, emotional level, I also think it was, like, a good character exploration of the Joker in that scene as well.
Well, it's easy how you got him to do the songs, because they were the founding members of the Purple Suit Society. My favorite scene is the parade scene, because to me that tells a lot about Tim Burton's view of humanity and society in general, which is they're more interested in grabbing the bills than they are in doing what's right. And it's so 1989. I mean, this is after we've had Wall Street and, you know, all the different films about greed and such. And it just kind of struck me as going, yeah, that's about right.
Most indelible moment for me, though, is the museum. It's just between the Prince song, the notion of how he's defacing the art and kind of the kooky campiness of it in the middle of the sequence. It's the first time that he introduces himself to Vicky. It's the first time that she gets saved by Batman. Whenever I think about this movie, I think about that scene.
Yeah, when I think about the indelible moments from this film, it comes at the very end, and it's the final reveal of the bat signal. And that bat signal is not only like a hearkening that, hey, this thing is going to project forward, even though our story ended. And credit to Burton and to Warner Brothers, by the way, for actually ending a story. If this movie were made today, it would probably be, Basinger's character becomes Harley Quinn, and we'll get a stinger at the end, and then we'll see him again in 3 years. But when the movie ends and we see that bat signal, we know that we are now a part of something that's going to carry on beyond the credits. And to me, that's an indelible moment.
So my most indelible was the death of Thomas and Martha Wayne. Because it's almost become a joke in Batman movies that you have to see his parents die. Like, it's not a Batman movie if you don't see his parents die. But there's so much imagery in this movie in particular that has been carried over to literally every other version of this scene that we have seen. Like the pearls on the ground, the gun in the face. Like, there's so many things in particular in this scene that I think was shot in such a way that we've seen over and over again, and this version of it is the one that has kind of like been so influential in a lot of Batman media moving forward.
And I would definitely agree with that.
Mine was Ace Chemical, simply because it's the most shocking aspect of the film, and how it transforms a petty criminal into a maniacal criminal supermind.
All right, so that looks like a good spot for our second break. We'll be right back. Before we jump back into the episode, and before we get to the Stanley Rubric in a minute, if you're ever curious about our Master Greatest Movies of All Time list that has every graded movie we've ever discussed on the show, there's a link in the episode description of every episode of this show, or you can go to RonnieDuncanStudios.com/GMOTE podcast and find it as the top entry on the Greatest Movie of All Time podcast show page. That is the grades we've done so far for all 198 movies we've graded, and we continue to add more each week. Make sure to check that out as we go and follow along. Also, you can follow each individual episode on our website as well. That has the notes for each individual episode with all of our scores, category nominations, and the individual factoids for each episode of this show. Just click the link in the episode description of this episode or go to RonnieDuncanStudios.com/GMOTE podcast to find that. Dad, do we have anyone to remember this week?
Yes. Hiram Caston, 71, American comedian and actor. Was in Seinfeld, Curb Your Enthusiasm, and The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Tony LoBianco, 87, American actor. The Honeymoon Killers, The French Connection, and The 7-Ups. Tony Mordente, 88, American actor, choreographer, dancer, and TV director. Was in West Side Story, both the original play or the original Broadway cast and Best Picture of 1961.
And so we honor these here for their contributions to the arts with a moment of silence in their honor. Thank you. All right, let's make the awkward transition to best funniest lines, which, let's be honest, these are mostly the Joker's lines. I'll start with, have you ever danced with the devil in the pale moonlight?
Never rub another man's rhubarb.
I have a feeling my dad's going to use that one.
I will.
Yeah.
Vicky Vale, what do you want? The Joker, my face on the $1 bill. Vicky, you must be joking. The Joker, do I look like I'm joking?
I'm going to the Vicky Vale. Well, I mean, let's face it. You're not exactly normal, are you? Batman. It's not exactly a normal world, is it?
Nick, what are you? Batman. I'm Batman.
The Joker, where does he get those wonderful toys?
The Joker, this town needs an enema.
I'm going to use that line too.
Bruce Wayne, I know who you are. Let me tell you about this guy. I know Jack. Mean kid, bad seed, hurt people. The Joker. I like him already.
I have given a name to my pain, and it is Batman.
Bruce Wayne, you're a nice girl, and I like you a lot. But right now, shut up. Oh, I wish
And
I
while
could
we're
use
on the
that
theme
line
of
more.
people getting canceled, Bruce
Ugh.
Wayne as Batman, you weigh a little more than 108.
The Joker. Batman. Can somebody tell me what kind of a world we live in where a man dressed as a bat gets all of the press?
I am out.
Same.
Joker. Now comes the part I relieve you, the little people, of the burden of your failed and useless lives. But as my plastic surgeon always said, if you gotta go, go with a smile.
I'll do this
He's
one in
getting
there.
way too into the character there.
I'll do this
Picking
one
up
in
some
there.
Nicholson there, Dana. I like that.
Vicky Vale, you're insane. Joker, I thought I was a Pisces.
All right. Anyone have any left? Going once, going twice. All right, let's move to the Stanley rubric then. Legacy is up first. Dad, so as not to put our guests on the spot, would you like to go first or second?
I will actually go first this time. For the industry, I think for the most part, what ended up happening is the success of the early films made it likely that further superhero films were going to be done. The Schumacher debacles kind of ruined that to some extent. But I think in the back of most of the industry's minds, the producers, the studios, that if done correctly, they could still be successful. And so that kind of allowed some of these franchises, the Marvels, the DCs to go forward. So from a legacy point of view, even though that there was that period of, out in the wasteland, I'm going to go with a 4 for the industry. For the public, unless you were from that immediate age group right around there where you were a kid around that time frame, I'm finding people my age or older never really connected with it. People younger connect with the Nolan films. So this film really does not have a real connection with a broad audience for the public. So unfortunately, for the public in general, and again, we always poll my staff of, what are we here, like 24 or 25 people, and kind of get a feel. And the only ones that really were able to say much about the film were people that were over about 45 or were in your age group, Tom, right around that time where this was influential as a child. So I went with a 1.5 for the public.
Wow. I'm sorry. That's just drastically low.
All right. I debated it. So convince me. I could go higher.
So what's your overall score then? You had
A 5.5. Now, give me a reason why I should go higher on the public, because I almost was at a 2.
So first off, if we're going to establish on just the industry side that this film is big for the lineage of the comic book era and what eventually would come, if you even give it half the credit for that it possibly deserves, and the continuation of one of the most famous characters in all of Western canon, I think it has to get a lot of credit on that end. Then you talk about the franchising, the toys, the merchandise, the multiple sequels, the fact that this has been remade every couple of years because this is a hot property. I think that the industry recognizes that this is a commodity that they have to keep trying to mine every couple of years, because no matter how bad a certain Batman film is, their public will go out and see the next set. We've already had 2 different versions of crappy Batman films. Batman versus Superman and Batman and Robin, and, different eras. But we did have bad Batman films, and yet people still lined up and went out and saw the Batman. It's just going to happen. So because of that, and partly due to the fact that this established we are no longer the Adam West Batman, where a slightly darker tone will adopt some of the campiness and such, but it allows us some freedom to make and shift the character how we want to across different regions and eras. And it becomes kind of like James Bond, that it adjusts to who the audience is at any moment that is receiving it. I think it's more closer to a 4.5. I can't go a full 5 just because of the legacy of Batman and how especially as we move out of the comic book era, in my opinion, that it's not quite as important as it was maybe 5-10 years ago. I still think there's a lot of reverence for this within the industry. But on an audience side, whether you have seen the movie or not, everybody in the Western Hemisphere, essentially, has heard of Batman. And it's partly on the backing of this movie. It created, or it launched, an era of Batman being one of the central heroes and figures of my lifetime. Whether we talk about the animated TV shows that everybody grew up with as a result of this, whether we talk that it made room for X-Men or Spider-Man or any of the stuff that came afterward, whether you had a personal affinity to Jack Nicholson as the Joker, the fact that we've since had 2 different people win Oscars for doing the Joker is because Jack Nicholson did this role. So to me, it's much more important than you're giving it credit for, and it has a much longer knock-on effect, even though it's maybe limited to a more niche age group. And even though this isn't my Batman, and I'm not a particular fan of this film, I still had a 4.5. So I have a 9.
Spot on, Tom. Spot on. Dana, all respect, I think you missed it on this one because the legacy is the logo. And if we've been alive the last 20 years of Hollywood entertainment, it has been clearly defined by commercialized superhero films. It is now its own genre because of this movie. It wasn't really its own genre with Richard Donner's Superman. This movie is what kept Hollywood alive this many decades in the future. And yes, I know Marvel's on the back end and all things will come and go. But that's the legacy, is this logo. So in terms of an industry perspective, I can tell you right now, the industry's been eating very well for decades, starting with Iron Man. There was no Iron Man without Spider-Man before it and without this movie before that. So the legacy from an industry standard is a 5. Okay, now, yes, there's some generational, this isn't my Batman, that's your Batman and all that kind of stuff. But again, it's the logo. I have kids. Go play at the park. Kids are rocking the traditional 89 Batman logo on shoes, on t-shirts, on toys, whether they've seen the movie or not, whether they know that Nicholson, there it is. Yeah, look at Tom's window right now. Whether you know that Jack Nicholson is the most awarded Academy Award winner of all time for an actor, whether you know that or not, you know Batman. And so from a fan perspective, whether they like it or not, 4.5. That's a 9.5 overall.
I went a similar direction to Adam, but I flipped it a bit. So within the industry, I gave it a 4 because I think that, like I said at the beginning of this, I think that this movie gets a lot of credit that probably really goes to Batman the Animated Series, but that wouldn't have existed without this movie. So I think that this movie deserves a lot of credit for like setting up the first domino that led to superhero movies within the industry. And that's why I gave it a 4 for in the industry. For public perception, I gave it a 5. Because I think that after this movie came out, Batman was unavoidable. And that didn't exist before. That wasn't the case before this. Like, it was a comic book property that Adam West had a comedy show about in the 60s. After this movie came out, like, Batman was everywhere. And I don't think that was a coincidence. So I think that this movie was like wildly has a huge legacy when it comes to the public perception. And I think that Batman was sort of like ingrained into the public consciousness because of this movie.
So I'll give you an opportunity. Did you want to change or adjust how you feel before I put the scores into the good old trusty calculator here?
Peer pressure.
All right. I like my industry score because of the hiatus. The public, you have kind of influenced me with the logo and with the comment, and the simple fact that Michael Keaton at a commencement address stands and goes as his last line, "I'm Batman," and the kids all cheered. Okay, so I'll go from my 1.3 to a 3 on the public. So I'll go with a 7. I understand I'm going to be the outlier here, but I think I'm going to be more in line with the remaining scores.
So that is an 8.63 between the four of us. As far as impact and significance, I think the biggest thing that this movie did is, outside of Superman, which obviously was a very important character and kind of made all of comic book films after it possible, but it took comic books as an art form and made it palatable for non-nerds. I mean, it's one thing for the rest of us that have all loved comic books and, made superheroes our thing, but that was a niche art until a certain period of time. And with every barrier and every new series or franchise or character that came to light that the public embraced, I think it knocked down another barrier to the point where we got to nerd majority culture, which obviously I think kind of kicked down the final door when we got Big Bang Theory, but where everybody's wearing comic book t-shirts and can say the lines from the Joker verbatim without much trouble. It's just kind of become a different era. And so from an industry standpoint, that set up a lot of things, whether that be Tim Burton is able to make just about whatever he wants for passion projects, whether that's Ed Wood or Edward Scissorhands or getting Nightmare Before Christmas on the shelves, whatever you want to put in that, or that Jack gets this gigantic payday, or the franchising that takes place with all of this and the toys and the stuff that I grew up with, whether that be the animated series. I think the industry, for me, is a pretty easy 5. And for the public embrace of this, even though it wasn't necessarily the biggest movie of the year internationally, domestically, it was a huge deal. And we've already talked about the cultural impact that it had on kids, on franchise media, on home sales. This thing was a phenomenon for a while. And even Batman Returns was enormous because of the legacy of just having this character out there. So I'm at a rare 10. Go ahead, Dad.
I'm at a 10.
Anything to add?
Not really. I mean, I lived through this period as an adult. I understand. I clearly understand. You mentioned how it became vogue to like comic books. And so I have no qualms about the impact and significance within that first few years period. So I went with a 10. My problem is that I see places where it declined for a period of time, but did not completely fall out of favor, and that's why I gave it lesser for legacy.
Every now and again, we run into a movie that makes an impact tremor, kind of like the T-Rex with the glass of water, right? And in 1989, this movie didn't just move the needle, it broke the gauge. It broke the gauge in terms of the way that the industry marketed itself, its stars. It changed the way that stars' contracts were negotiated once word got out about what Nicholson had pulled off. This was the defining moment. And so, Dana, I have to agree with you wholeheartedly. The impact, the overall significance of this movie, it is a 10 out of 10 when you look at the way that we make movies today.
Well, sorry to put you on the spot, Terry, if you didn't have a 10.
Oh yeah, I'm so sorry, guys. So my impact within the industry, I put a 3-4, and the reasoning for this, I'll explain. The reasoning for this is I thought of this category more as like how the movie was perceived at the time, and I think it's important to note that there weren't a lot of like Oscar buzz for like the big categories at this time. Like Nicholson wasn't nominated for Best Actor or Best Supporting Actor. Like that's weird, right? Like you think he was. And back at this time, because like now I think that we think of the Oscars as this weird like avant-garde thing that like only movies that are in like art houses get nominated. But like back then, like blockbusters got nominated pretty regularly. So I think it is sort of telling that the industry didn't think of it seriously at the time, like in that way. That was like a way that they should like honor with like critical awards. So that is why I gave it a 3 within the industry. I did give it a 4 for public, just because everything we've said already, like I think it's been wildly impactful. So I ended up giving it a 6. No, yeah. No, a 7. total.
And to make your point, the previous year's box office winner, Rain Man, did win Best Picture. So there is that.
There's a little bit of a skew there, though, because fewer movies were released. There was fewer advertising dollars being dumped into each of these releases. And today we get 10 nominees. Back then there were only 5. Nicholson was nominated in the Best Actor category, comedy or musical, at the Golden Globes. So no, he wasn't recognized for the Oscar, but he was recognized on a pretty high level.
I mean, I'm seeing from what I have here that there were at least 120 some movies that were released in 1989. And it's not even like a bad year of any variety here. You got Christmas Vacation, Pet Sematary, Field of Dreams, Uncle Buck, Turner and Hooch, When Harry Met Sally, Dead Poets Society, Parenthood, Back to the Future Part 2, Ghostbusters 2, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, Lethal Weapon 2, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. So a lot of sequel stuff, franchising type material that doesn't look all that dissimilar from now.
Tom, we didn't mention the best movie that came out in 1989. Do the Right Thing. Do the Right Thing.
But that's also an example of a smaller movie. And this is also the same year as Sex, Lies, and Videotape, which kind of launches the indie revolution. So we're on the cusp of something, but he is somewhat right that the 80s and even the 70s was a lot of blockbusters and stuff that was in vogue in popular culture getting nominated for stuff. It wasn't quite the years of Pulp Fiction or, even American Beauty kind of coming out of nowhere to be the art house stuff.
Coda.
Well, that's a completely different era where it only exists in one place that almost nobody has, Apple TV.
Well, what I think about is Chadwick Boseman getting nominated was like such people thought it was so bizarre and so unique that he was nominated for a superhero movie. But I don't think that would have been the case. If the MCU existed in the 80s, if these many superhero movies were released, I think we would have probably pretty regularly been seeing superhero actors get nominated for things. The industry has just shifted so much to these sort of art house films that it's unusual that Nicholson didn't get nominated at all, for Best Supporting Actor.
Well, I will say in defense of this, and now to argue both sides efficiently, nothing from Superman really got nominated either, and that was the biggest film, I believe, of 1978. So it's not like Christopher Reeve or Gene Hackman was really getting nominated for stuff either. Margot Kidder wasn't in any awards conversations. So, you kind of play on both sides of it. I get the point that you're making, but I also think there are examples to point to that kind of undercut it as well. So, I can play both sides, being the person in law school for the last 33 years.
Not to litigate, the Oscars and some of the mistakes that they've made historically. There's a different great podcast for that. But how many times was Harrison Ford nominated for Indiana Jones? I think we have a long history for taking this type of big movie, box office success, a large marketing bucket. It comes with toys. It comes with T-shirts. And it's almost like the Academy voters for a long period of time have just put it in a different category. It's like the pat on the head. Hey, that was nice. We're so glad you did this for the industry, but we're not going to recognize it because it doesn't meet our artistic standards. And that seems to have been the case for a very long time. And I think the point that Terry brought up was a good one. It might have not been until Black Panther that people really started looking at cultural movements as a legitimate form of entertainment, whether it has a big box office or not. And I think that that's important. And maybe that's part of the legacy of this film, is that somebody had to crack that ice before we could finally get through it and realize, no, this is okay to recognize this form of entertainment as being important.
Because even The Dark Knight was only nominated for it was not nominated for Best Picture. It got nominated for Heath Ledger winning as the Joker. I think that there's still some undercut because Star Wars is nominated for Best Picture, but gets nothing but technical awards thereafter. And I don't think Lucas was even nominated for Best Director. And then we get Empire, which I think is on most critics' greatest films list, but it doesn't get recognized almost at all.
Which brings me to a point. We've mentioned Chicago several times, and one of my favorite places in the whole world to go to the Art Institute of Chicago.
Yeah.
And if you go into the Art Institute and you go into the Impressionist section, if you were to somehow or another do a National Treasure expose and be able to lift the paintings off the wall and look at the backs of some of them, they're all going to have red R's stamped on them. And that is because Impressionist art was such a revolution in the 1870s and 1880s in Paris that they were refused for exhibition at the Art Institute in Paris for the national exhibits. And the R stands for refuse, French for refused, because they didn't understand them. And ultimately, that's what we're talking about, is that these films were presented as being fun, lark, popcorn type film, and not for any actual artistic ability or value. And it's taken time for people to realize that these are not necessarily easy to make or to make them well. And so there is a certain aspect of artistic quality that it has, because having watched this film, I was surprised as to how really well made it was.
All right, we got to move on. So Novelty then, as far as originality, you only had one other thing to look upon with Superman, and this is a completely different type of film. You're establishing a completely different tone than the Adam West Batman, that while it had a movie, it's just in a completely different universe. The costuming is different, the art design, the score, everything else separates it from what came before it. So I have a 4 on the originality side of this. However, in an execution, there are some things that are lacking, and yes, I know I'm getting somewhat of a victim of comparison, but it just doesn't hold up quite as well for me on certain aspects of it. The costume looks a little weird or funky comparative to some of the ones that came after it. It could have been tightened up. The way that the bat wings come out, where he's got that like full extension, just looks a little crude, if you ask me. I don't think that Tim Burton, being not really a comic book fan, does detract a little bit from the movie, in the fact that he doesn't really respect some of the mythos. He takes one of the more important comic books and then he kind of plays around with it a little too much for my taste a bit. The Joe Chill thing aside, there are other pieces of this movie where I feel that he stamps all over it to kind of create what he wants out of a Batman mythos, as opposed to respecting what came before it. So on that side, I'll still give it a 3, but I have a 7.
Yeah, in terms of novelty, I think you touched on something important when you talk about the artistic design and the way that this film looks and the tactile nature of Gotham City. One thing we haven't brought up yet is the Batmobile. And I think we've had these different evolutions through time of what the Batmobile has become. And I think they all have their individual merits. But this Batmobile, the first time we see it, the first time we witness its functionality, the first time it drops the bomb and acts as chemicals, when he says shields into his mouthpiece and in it tightens up, that was extremely novel for the time. That was something that I think I underestimated. I didn't really think much about the Batmobile before that. And that was something that definitely stuck with me. So in terms of the artistic design of it, I do think that there are some things that have not aged incredibly well. I'm going to mash the two sides here together, give 4s on both for a total of 8.
Yeah, I feel pretty similarly to Adam. I felt like it was probably like a 5 for novelty. Like, I think that a lot of the ideas in this were very unique, and I think that a lot of the ideas and the production design aspects that, like you mentioned, Tom, I think that they were things that were unique to the time and really did influence how we sort of like perceive these kinds of franchise movies moving forward. But I gave it like a 3 for the execution because of primarily because of the script, if I'm being fully honest. I think the acting was good. I think the directing was good. I think that it just was a sort of bland script overall.
So now I get to reverse my role, which is I'm going to be higher than all of you.
There we go.
Think back of the Batman Adam West and of the Donner Christopher Reeves Superman. the characters were dropped into realism. The real world as we knew it. This is novel because Burton created an alternative universe. The universe of the comic book that Batman was in. It was darker. It was more nemesing. It was a place that none of us really wanted to be, but we could see eventually things evolving into that, but for Batman. So I give it bigger credence for the simple fact that it created an alternative genre, which is not putting a superhero in everyday life and seeing how he functions, but creating an alternative universe and putting him in a position where he not only survives, but thrives. And so I am at an 8.5 for Novelty for that reason.
So that's a 7.88 average between the four of us. Classicness. Dad, I'll let you lead.
Usually we start around a 7. And there's a lot of this that ages well. And I did make the comment that I did think that the character, she's trying to change the brooding guy. I mean, it's something that I've noticed throughout my life, which is why certain dynamics of why women seem drawn to the bad boys, And so it just struck me as I was watching it again that yet she thinks she's going to be the one to change him. And like she's going to be bigger than the psychological trauma, the PTSD associated with watching his parents be murdered. And so that kind of just struck me wrong. But I do think the fact is that she is a strong character within this, which in the 80s, finding female characters who were actually like more than just superfluous was not always the case. I mean, it started about this time frame, but I think she helped propel it. So I'm going to give it a 0.5 point up simply because of that. I can't give it any more than that simply because of what I perceive as being the stereotype. So I'm going to give it a 7.5.
I'll get mine out of the way. I do think that this suffers from some comic book inaccuracies. It suffers from a little bit of the technology of its day, that it just can't be quite as forward as, the Nolan movies, which are obviously a little bit better made, had a lot better budget. Was the helped along by the fact that technology had advanced so much in that time frame. I also don't think it's particularly timeless. And while I said that the Vicky Vale character is a little bit better written for comic books than they were at the time, that doesn't mean that she's still not a plot device to be saved throughout the course of the film. She's there to basically be the foil, the tug of war between the Joker and Batman, which if they're fighting over something and the duality of what they're trying to accomplish, you're trying to see both sides of their same argument. That's essentially what they're doing. So I have a 6.
Yeah. So I feel similarly about Vicky Vale. I think that she, I like to say that she has what I call Princess Jasmine syndrome, which is that she's a character that's sort of like painted as a character that has a lot of agency, but like isn't actually. Like they like to write her in a way that makes it seem like she's making a lot of decisions, but also like she's really just advancing the other character's story along. Yeah, she's the only woman in the movie also. Like Alicia's in it, but she's quite literally a prop. Like she's not even really a character. So I think that does knock it a little bit on classicness. As far as diversity, I think that Billy D. Williams is kind of like a stroke of genius for the time. Like it's wildly progressive to have someone like him in a role like Harvey Dent that could potentially be more important later. He wasn't, but could have been. And I think that that's something that we should give it some credit for, that they cast a potentially important role to someone like Billy D. Williams. But then like there's literally nothing queer in it, which I think is kind of a good bad thing for this time, which is to say there's no like offensive jokes. That is pretty common for this time in this kind of movie. But also like zero representation also when it comes to that. So I think with that in mind, I gave it a 6 for classicness.
I mean, to be fair, this is a very limited cast list for as big a movie as this is, and to use a pretty significant comic book character on a black district attorney at the time coming out of the Reagan era, well, maybe that's a point I overlooked.
I mean, it was also a film that took place in a major metropolis that had to be incredibly diverse, like New York, like Chicago, like Los Angeles. And for that to not pop up anywhere in the film other than your random henchman that had no lines of dialogue, let's face it, I mean, by today's standards, that's something that would be brought up. It was 1989. I know it was a different time. We've talked a lot about Vicky Vale. She was literally a woman dangling on a string on multiple occasions throughout the film.
Mm.
And there's been so many iterations of this movie that have come out since, whether he's wearing a bat suit or otherwise, that I think have atoned for some of the mistakes. But I also don't ask this film to pay the price because it was first. I know Superman came out 11 years earlier. But in a modern sense, and in a modern Hollywood, and in a modern marketing world, this movie was first. And so, yes, there were mistakes. I'm going to go 7 for the classicness of Batman.
One thing I did want to say too, just before we end classicness, I think talking about the parade scene, I think is worth talking about, because like the way that they painted the people that were getting the money from the Joker was like, aren't these people so greedy? But like, we know that Gotham is like a crime infested town, which means that there's probably like loads of poverty with people just like trying to get by. Like people always say, why don't they move out of Gotham? Well, they can't afford to, right? Like they
There's
probably
no middle
just
class.
Right. So like these people that are going to get money from the Joker are like desperate and trying to find a way to like get out of the situation. But I feel like the movie paints them in such a way that's like, well, they committed one of the 7 deadly sins, so they deserved what they got. But it's like, no, like this is a tragic moment that the Joker created, and the movie doesn't really paint it in that way at all. And I think that that's worth mentioning too when it comes to like the perception of this movie and the way that they treat sort of like these social issues.
So that's a 6.63 average between the four of us. Rewatchability. I'll let our guests lead, whichever of you would like to start.
Yeah, this being a film that I've seen probably 30 times now, originally in the theater. I know I owned it on VHS. I bought it again on DVD. It ran on cable for a long time. It's not on one, but 2 major streaming services right now. This is a film that is so rewatchable that I could start it from the beginning, the middle, or from any scene that you randomly choose, and I can watch it to the very end. This is a rewatchable 10. I've talked about how much it meant to me in my childhood, but this is a film that it doesn't matter because the pace is so great. You can pick up and get to your favorite part very quickly.
Yeah, so for me, I gave it like a 3 for how likely I might have watched this on my own, because I've not watched this in a very long time. So just like the realistic answer of like how often have I turned it on my own is not that likely. But I could see myself like putting together like Batman watch parties, but because it's a superhero movie, because it's that genre, like I could see myself doing things with friends to like put it to like show it in that kind of a context. So that's why I gave it a 3, because it is like sort of part of this like this canon that I think is important to superhero movies, that I could see myself sort of like watching from that context. I did give it a 4 for will I turn this off if it's on, because like I wouldn't, right? Like if I was in a hotel and it's on, I would likely sit there and watch it if I didn't have anything else going on. But that's the key. Like it wouldn't keep me there if I had something else going on. You know, like it's not a thing that I would like stay in the hotel room if I had something I wanted to do. Like I would leave if I had like a dinner reservation or something. So ultimately I give it a 7 for rewatchability.
There's an issue about evolution, even though we're 200 and how many movies in so far?
So this will be our 199th ranked film, but I believe this is episode 216.
Okay. So there are a list of films that I regularly rewatch. Okay. Because they're my favorites or whatever reason, or I just need to feel, the warm blanket on a cold day type of thing. Okay. So I always am rather harsh with rewatchability. But to be perfectly honest, I almost rewatched this today, but for the fact that I had so many things that I had to try to get done before the end of the week with my schedule and such. Even though I'm the boss and nobody dares question me what I do in my office, I almost put it on my tablet and rewatched it again because I'm like, yeah, I think maybe a second time through I might actually even like it better than I did the first time.
What's wrong with a little fun?
Fun and law, it's kind of a juxtaposition that,
Don't give me that. You've had plenty of fun over the years, raking somebody over the coals or taking a judge to task or eliminating or eviscerating a vocational expert. You have plenty of fun at your job or you wouldn't do it.
True. But still. Nevertheless. Rewatchability on a regular basis is a 7 to me. Where I'm going to put it on and it's going to be something I'm going to watch every 1 or 2 years I'm going to give this just one step below and I'm going to go with a 6.5 for that. I'm going to watch this again probably within the next 6 to 12 months simply because I was surprised at how much I liked it. I'm not sure that if I would have watched it in 1989, I would have had that reaction. But part of that is called maturation and understanding things much more than when you were younger.
So wait, am I the only person that saw this in the movie theater in 1989?
I believe so.
Oh my goodness.
You probably were.
That's not a comment on the movie, though. Tom and I were both too young. I was 3 and Tom was not born. So that's probably a factor.
So it just came down to me and Dana.
Yeah.
And he was starting a career and I was starting life.
And about 5 months later, I was trying to start Tom.
Apparently successfully.
Yes.
Anywho, moving on. All right, for mine, I have recently started putting on kind of a criteria with the rubric to give myself a little bit easier challenge of how to affix a particular number to these. So for the likelihood that I would put it on of my own volition, it would come out at probably a 2 because I'm probably only going to put this on if I have to. It's just, I'm much more partial to the animated series. I'm much more partial to the Nolan verse, even the Batman. But that being said, I probably would put the original Batman on before I'm putting on the Adam West Batman or Batman versus Superman, if that makes any difference to anyone out there.
It's not exactly high praise, Tom.
I know it's a low bar. But I probably would leave it on for a few scenes if I found it on somewhere or it was just kind of like in a library and I'm scrolling through something and whatever else. But I'm definitely not stopping my day. I'm not making a plan to watch it later. It's fine if I watch like 5 minutes and, we're somewhere in there. So I would have probably around a 3 on that side of it. I have a 5. So that makes the average for this category a 7.13 between the 4 of us. For audience score, this is one of the rare times that Google and Rotten Tomato users have agreed. They both had it at 84%, giving us an 8.4. So to repeat the categories, we had an 8.63 average for legacy, a 9.25 for impact and significance, a 7.88 for novelty, a 6.63 for classicness, a 7.13 for rewatchability, and an 8.4 for audience score, giving us a final total of 47.92, and currently placing it on our list between Rocky and From Here to Eternity at number 78.
Did Batman just finish in front of Rocky?
It finished ahead of From Here to Eternity.
Oh, okay.
Just behind Rocky.
Oh, okay.
It's not bad.
Like by 0.03 behind Rocky.
Honestly, it's a little higher than what I had guessed.
But to bring up a film that we just mentioned, it is only a couple of slots behind Do the Right Thing.
My opinion, that is far underrated on that list.
And you will be appreciative that we are revisiting that one later this summer.
Let's go.
Our mutual acquaintance is actually going to be a part of that episode. So, all right, moving on. Remaining questions for this one. Why is Batman so flippant with revealing his identity?
What a great question.
The whole point is to protect people that you supposedly like, but you just like seemingly want to give away the goods at any point in the film.
Yeah, I have a similar question, which is the whole how did Vicky get into the Batcave? Like, did Alfred let her in? Whatever. Because like all of those scenes where Alfred was like, Vicky seems like a nice girl, she seems kind of special. I read those in the moment as Alfred being like, you got to get out there and not just be Batman. You got to like get a social life. You got to talk to people. So he was like pushing Vicky, not because he thought she was actually special, but just because like, you're someone. Go talk to someone, please. It's not me. But then whenever he let her in the Batcave, it's like, oh, so he meant that the whole time? That feels fast. They've had 5 conversations total. I don't know why this justifies her getting his largest secret.
I wonder if in 1989, sleeping together once meant more in film culture than it does now, where that means next to nothing.
You know, it's interesting, Terry. You just brought that up about how much Alfred seemed to want Bruce to have a normal life. Those sentiments seem to be repeated quite a bit with the Michael Caine version in the Nolan movies of Alfred. And I actually find that to be one of the most endearing things about the character, is that he cared about Bruce and he tolerated Batman. And so, yeah, I don't know all about like blowing his cover and inviting this photographer who literally works for a newspaper into the Batcave. But there seems to be something about his love for Bruce superseding his love for what Bruce represents. And I actually really like that about the character in both iterations.
Also, a question that we have to address before we end this show, because it's always a hot button topic. Not where does Keaton rank for you among Batmen, but rather where do you rank Nicholson amongst the Jokers? I personally have it Ledger 1, Hamill 2, probably Nicholson 3, but he's pretty close to Cesar Romero for me.
Oh my God.
And then very far down, like there's a giant gap between any of these actors and Jared Leto. But anyway, I digress.
Yeah.
This isn't going to surprise anybody. Nicholson is my Joker. He will always be my Joker. Love Heath Ledger. Love the performance. Think he's a brilliant actor. I think he is the beneficiary of a little bit of a Kurt Cobain effect here. I don't want to besmirch his good name. I think he was outstanding, but he's not with us anymore. And so that became the lasting memory of that character and of him for a lot of people. And I think he gets lionized for that. And I think as great as it was, there's a little bit of recency bias, which is why I still go Nicholson as my Joker.
I feel pretty similarly to Tom. One is Ledger for me. I was always a big fan of Heath Ledger before Dark Knight. Like I liked him in 10 Things I Hate About You and A Knight's Tale and various other, I loved him. I loved Heath Ledger before that. And I thought this was like a really great showcase of his skills and a really interesting like role for him. So I loved him as the Joker. Hamill is like a close second. It's hard for me to choose between them, honestly. But honestly, after rewatching this movie, Nicholson is like solidly third to me. I think it's a pretty accurate portrayal of the character. And you guys know how I feel about the script. I said it a lot in this episode. But I think that Nicholson really brought this character to life in a way that was not on the page. Like he made the character far more interesting than the script allowed him to. And I think that that's worth noting. So like Nicholson is solidly 3 for me. Then Cesar Romero, and then did Jared Leto play Joker? I'm not sure he did. I might have blocked that out of my mind.
We forgot to rank Joaquin, but I would have him somewhere around Cesar Romero too. Like he's somewhere probably just above Jared, that gulch that is Jared Leto. But okay. Dad, do you even care?
Cesar Romero. No.
It's fine.
Ever the contrarian.
I like Jack because
Thank you.
Jack had the real cross between a serious villain and the fact that the character's name was Joker. Ledger played him so dark and so villainous that I just, although I really respect the performance and think he was phenomenal as far as what he was trying to accomplish, I just don't necessarily agree that Joker should have been that. There's nothing about the basic premise of Joker is that even though he's horrible and you should hate him, there's a certain part of him that you kind of go, oh, yeah, okay, I can understand why people might follow him because,
Yes, definitely preach to me what the Joker actually represents in comic book lore.
Okay.
I've got more questions.
Yeah.
That's fine. That's fine, Tom. I'll keep that arrow in my quiver.
Here's what I want to know. Why has it taken until me bringing this up right now for the people at Warner Brothers to get their money together and to pay for 5 balloons in this year's Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade? You need a clown, a crying baby, a tiger, an elephant, and an octopus with 5 tentacles. Throw those in there and just see if anybody notices. See, you want to talk about the legacy of a movie? You see those 5 balloons rolling down Fifth Ave. Let's just see who notices and which way they go.
I don't know if you need all 5. I think if you just got the Joker balloon, but point taken.
And a Joker float, or like a Nicholson impersonator, is doing the Joker bit.
I'm there for that.
I might actually watch the parade for the first time in my life.
Let's go. See, it's all about marketing. Tom, I got to ask you a question. What happened to Kim Basinger's career? I think we were all at least lukewarm on her performance here. It was like Batman, Cool World, 8 Mile. She's gone. What happened?
Well, didn't she win Best Supporting Actress for LA Confidential?
Was that a win?
I thought she won. I can fact check it here quick, but
yeah, let me look.
Playing Veronica Lake. I'm not sure she did.
I think she was nominated.
I know she was nominated. I don't think she won. That's one of my favorite films, by the way.
Including Best Picture. Winning 2, Best Supporting Actress for Basinger and Adapted Screenplay. So, yeah. So, but I thought that was like the last stand. And I think to a degree, if I were to put my finger on it, it's the issue that all leading actresses eventually have is moving into more support roles where, okay, Meryl Streep was kind of able to do it, but there was a little bit of a gap between some of the stuff in the 90s where she was still a lead actress and then getting to Devil Wears Prada. And now she's guest starring on Only Murders in the Building. Like, it depends on how you want to take your career. And once you no longer have those starring roles, are you able to suck up enough ego to let that go?
She was having children.
Well, that's possible too.
She was married at that time to Alec Baldwin, and then there was a huge row after about 4 or 5 years. I think she had like 2-3 kids right in like succession, and about the time she was going to come back into Hollywood, she had this whole thing. I mean, Alec Baldwin's behavior kind of destroyed his career for a while. And so when women take the time out to have children, they're not always able to just pop back in. Now, several stars have been able to do it, but several others haven't. And so they've taken other paths. And I mentioned for a fact one Reese Witherspoon who, after she took her time out to have her children, had difficulty. So she just decided she would start producing her own films or her own projects that she could either star in or produce herself. So she didn't have to deal with the age problem for women in Hollywood.
Well, and that's I'll just say the question that I wanted to bring up. Like, that's what happened to her. She became 40 and she's a woman in Hollywood. Like, it's not that she wasn't talented or she didn't choose for her career to go this direction. There just aren't roles written for people like her. And it's unfortunate, and it's a problem in Hollywood. I mean, Reese Witherspoon only has a career because, as Dana said, she created her own opportunities for herself.
The biggest star on the female side of things in the 90s was Julia Roberts. And even she's had this completely disappearing act almost since then. Like, you might see her now in the last 5 years or so kind of pop up and stuff. She was in that Clooney movie last year. She was in that Sam Esmail directed film that I can't think of at the moment. But other than that, there's been like this gap of almost 20 years where she's been the starlet. You know, I think the last truly relevant thing that she did before she kind of disappeared was being a supporting character doing a bit gag, playing somebody trying to impersonate herself in Ocean's 12.
Men don't have that problem. I mean, Hollywood has no problem putting a 70-year-old
Liam Neeson.
With a 30-year-old whoever. You know, I mean, it's just kind of, they don't have a problem with that. Primarily, my guess is because of the sexism that exists in the production and distribution side of Hollywood, because they all perceive themselves as wanting to do the exact same thing.
Yeah, well, I guess we're not going to solve it tonight, but the writers can get busy. There's a lot of talented people over 40 out there.
One other question I had about this movie in particular is, why were there so few pictures of Bruce in the newspaper? He's a billionaire in Gotham. His family were prominent philanthropists, but there were like 3 pictures of him in the news at all that Knox was able to dig up for Vicky.
Yeah.
Why? What was that about?
Did you notice at one point Knox didn't know who he was? He was like, who is this guy? Some guy named Wayne. Like, as if everybody in the city wouldn't have known he was the guy who owned all the buildings.
Yeah, I thought it was a joke that if Vicky would have asked anyone else, where is Bruce Wayne, they would have been like, oh, obviously right here. So, like, I thought that's why he was the one that she asked, and that it was like a joke. But no, apparently other people wouldn't know either.
I guess my biggest issue with the ending of the film is the fact that very often in the comic book lore, Batman has his moral code, he will not kill, and yet he makes 2 rather obvious kills in this movie. One, throwing the henchman down the hole, essentially, and then tying up Nicholson to the gargoyle so that he falls to his death. Very intentionally.
Well, in legal defense of Batman / Bruce Wayne, gravity killed the Joker. So I'm just going to stand up and say he didn't know that was going to happen. So I don't think he technically killed the Joker.
I gave Batman a pass there because Batman would have been like, they could have ran and they didn't. So that's not on me. Like, they knew a bomb fell out and they didn't run. That's on them. And I gave him a pass for Joker because, you know, his entire life is about his parents being killed, and this is the guy that killed his parents. So I gave him a pass on that one. Like, he's allowed this one.
But he's also in the Batwing and the Batmobile, got guns with ammunition, and he's also firing rockets into a crowd during a parade.
They saw the rockets coming, though. They could have moved.
And his aim is impeccable. Nobody got hurt.
I just think Tim Burton fundamentally misunderstands Batman.
I don't think Tim Burton wanted to understand Batman. I think Tim Burton had his own agenda.
I do think there was a certain element with Burton where he was like, I'm going to get one shot at this. I'm going to do it my way. And it just so happened that it raked in so much money that he ended up getting 2 shots at it. But I do think that there was a little bit of I don't care about the canon. I'm going to make a Tim Burton Batman movie.
Well, and thank God Tim Burton was the last director to misunderstand Batman, and it never happened again. You know, we're just so lucky that he's the only director to misunderstand the character fundamentally.
Well, that's fair.
Yeah, well, and then I think after the second one, he kind of lost interest and said, I don't want to do this again. I'll just rake in the dough and produce it.
And that he has done.
So we do have one listener question, and it was somewhat directed to my co-host, but apparently there's only one right answer on this one. What is your favorite with a U, Batmobile from the Batman movies?
Actually, I like the Batmobile from this one.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. This is the coolest looking of the Batmobiles. Like,
I know.
Obviously, the Adam West one is kind of based off of a real car that they just re-rigged. And the Tumbler, I've always thought looked kind of awkward. I always actually liked the Bat Pod a little bit more than I liked the actual Batmobile from the Nolan movies. It just kind of, it's too tank-like. This one felt sleek. It felt like actually a car, and that it had much more capability.
I think this one is reminiscent of a souped-up Rolls Royce.
Oh, see, now don't ruin that for me.
Why?
Rolls Royces are so ugly.
Oh.
A quick shout out for the Matt Reeves Batmobile that Robert Pattinson drove. Souped up muscle car, very tactile, very something that you could see on the street. A lot of people say that it's akin to like a Barracuda, and I didn't know what to expect out of that. And it was probably the least flashy of the Batmobiles, but I found that really interesting, and its introduction in the Reeves film to be an amazing way to go about doing that. So I really appreciated that from the Batman movie.
I like that.
I will say that the chase down sequence where he chases down the Penguin and has that silhouette walk to the car is a very good scene in that movie, even if I have my issues with its Act 3.
My issue with the Batman, not to get into it, but I feel like it had about 3 endings in it, and it kept going each time.
It had a hard time walking away. It was like, I need more of a good thing, more of a good thing. But I don't know. I think the Reeves Batman turned out a lot better than many people expected it to.
I have my issues, and we'll address that on a future episode, I'm sure. But needless to say, it's still like Dark Knight is number 1 for me with a bullet point, and then everything else is kind of still trying to live up to that. But I want to thank both of our guests for joining us this evening. First, Adam, thank you as a new guest. Glad to have you. You are welcome back anytime, and I'm sure we can find some new guest spots that maybe aren't comic book related, since it seems like you have much broader thoughts beyond just this one. But thank you very much for joining us.
Guys, thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. I love the show. It means a lot to me that you would invite me to be a part of it.
And where can people find you if they like your work?
First and foremost, the website is moviearcher.com, and on all socials, just @moviearcher.
Perfect. And
it's
Terry,
a great place to spend a few minutes.
Thanks so much, Dana. I appreciate you saying that. A lot of people work very hard to make that website work.
And Terry, thank you again for being back with us. I know that you were very grateful to be on last year with us for The Fugitive, and we had held this thing out for a year, so I hadn't heard from you since then. I'm just glad that it still worked out, that you could be a part of this again with us as a returning guest. Just a reminder to any of our new or returning guests or any fans of the show, 5 times on the show gets you one of our hats. And so that is incentive to keep coming back, if nothing else. But you are, of course, welcome back anytime. So, but what or where can people find you as well?
Yeah, once again, thanks for having me. This was a great time. I love talking, fantasy and superheroes. So this is my bread and butter. I'm a fantasy author, so I've got books out there. You can check those out. My website is terrybartley.com. Easy to remember. Has everything you need. I've got the podcast, Post Writers or Fans, where I interview various creatives. I think it's a good time if you're interested in doing the kinds of things that we do. And then I play this D&D game every other week with the Chanting Sorcery Productions called Helios Harriers.
Perfect. And just for anyone that's looking for any links for either of our guests, those will be on our website, and I'm sure our resident Scooby-Doo villain will also have links for all of that with our social media next week when this episode is released. I would normally kick it to final thoughts here, but we are well over time with our recording. This is now the 3rd longest recording that we've ever had, only topped by the unabridged version of Bull Durham, where Dana and my guest just swapped baseball stories for like an hour and a half that I cut out of that in order to get it under 2 hours. And the very famous Back to the Future podcast that we had so many technical problems on it. It went for like 3 hours and 45 minutes. And I had to do a lot of weird editing before I had started doing odd editing. We will be honestly returning to Back to the Future next year or next season for its I think it's 40th anniversary, and we will be getting the original crew back together for that episode. That we will be doing a special episode with our friends from Germany, the super fans of Back to the Future. So look forward for that episode next year. But otherwise, Dad, thank you very much for being a part of this. Thank you again to our guests. That'll do it for us this week. Thank you for listening.
Really
Life is
appreciate
like
it,
a
you guys.
box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. Next week, for our 217th episode, we welcome back returning guest Sarah Duncan to the show and new guest Joe Beccari, an IG film commentator of I'll Get to It When I Get to It, to discuss one of the most controversial Best Picture winners of all time for its 30th anniversary, Forrest Gump from 1994. Directed by Robert Zemeckis, written by Eric Roth, music by Alan Silvestri, starring Tom Hanks, Robin Wright, Gary Sinise, and Sally Field. You won't want to miss that one, so watch ahead of the show by searching the Real Good app to find where it's streaming for you. That's REELGOOD. Please like, follow, rate, and review, or whatever on whichever platform you have so that more can join in our fun. You can also email the show at thenewRonnieDuncanStudios.com or at greatestalltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. Find us on YouTube, Instagram, X, Letterboxd, or TikTok at the handle @GModePodcast. Greatest Movie of All Time is a production of Ronnie Duncan Studios. Our show is mixed, edited, and written by Thomas Duncan. Our music is thanks to Purple Planet Music. Our technical provider and distributor is Captivate FM.